close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world draped in shadow. A world where knowledge was locked behind monastery doors, where questions were met with silence, and where the night sky above was nothing more than a canvas of mystery no one dared to touch. For centuries, humanity lived in this twilight, guided not by reason, but by tradition, by faith, by the whispers of those who came before. But then, somewhere in the quiet corners of Europe, a spark began to glow. It was soft at first, barely visible, like the first light of dawn touching the edge of a dark horizon. And slowly, steadily, that spark grew into a flame. It flickered in the minds of philosophers, burned in the hearts of scientists, and spread across continents like wildfire. This was not a revolution of swords or crowns. This was a revolution of thought. A revolution that would change everything. They called it the Enlightenment. And tonight, as the world outside your window settles into stillness, let us journey back to that moment when humanity dared to ask why. When minds awoke from centuries of slumber, and when the light of reason began to reshape the very soul of civilization. Let this story carry you gently, like a river moving through time, until sleep finds you somewhere along the way. Before we begin, if these words feel like a companion in the quiet hours, if they help ease the weight of the day and guide you toward rest, then perhaps this is a place you'd like to return to. Consider subscribing so that more stories like this can find you when the night grows long. Let this channel be a soft voice in the darkness, a gentle reminder that history too can be a lullaby. And now let us begin. Chapter 1. The World Before the Light. There was a time, not so very long ago in the grand sweep of history, when the world was a much smaller place. Not smaller in geography, but smaller in understanding, in possibility, in the reach of the human mind. If you had been born in the year 1500, your life would have unfolded along paths carved deep by centuries of tradition. You would have risen with the sun and rested when darkness fell. You would have known the rhythms of the seasons, the turning of the fields, the cycle of planting and harvest. Your world would have been bounded by the village where you were born, perhaps by the nearest town if fortune smiled upon you. But beyond that, beyond the familiar hills and the winding river, there lay mystery. Maps of the world bore strange creatures in their margins, warnings of lands where reason itself might cease to function. And above you, every night, the heavens turned in their silent dance. Beautiful and incomprehensible, a reminder that some things were simply beyond mortal understanding. This was the world before the Enlightenment. A world where knowledge was not a common possession but a rare and precious treasure, guarded jealously by those with the power to control it. The church stood at the center of everything, not merely as a place of worship, but as the keeper of truth itself. Scripture provided the answers to every question worth asking. The earth stood still at the center of creation, with the sun and stars revolving around it in perfect celestial harmony, because that was what had always been believed, and to suggest otherwise was not merely wrong but dangerous. Heresy was not just an error of judgment. It was a crime against the divine order, punishable by exile, by imprisonment, by fire. Books existed, of course, but they were rare beyond imagining. Before the printing press, each book had to be copied by hand, letter by letter, word by word, by monks working in cold scriptoriums, their fingers stiff with winter, their eyes straining in candlelight. A single book might take months, even years to complete. And so books were chained to shelves, locked away in monasteries and cathedral libraries, accessible only to those who had dedicated their lives to the church. Even if you could reach such a book, you would likely be unable to read it. Latin was the language of learning, and Latin was taught only to the clergy and the nobility. For the vast majority of people, the written word was as distant and mysterious as the stars themselves. Yet within this world of shadows and silence, something was stirring. The medieval order that had held firm for 1,000 years was beginning to show cracks, subtle at first, like hairline fractures in ancient stone. The Black Death had swept across Europe in the 14th century, carrying away perhaps a third of the population, and in its wake, the survivors began to question. If God was just, why had the innocent suffered alongside the guilty? If the Church held the keys to salvation, why had prayer not stopped the plague? These were dangerous thoughts, whispered rather than spoken, but they lingered in the air like smoke that would not dissipate. And then came the Renaissance, that glorious reawakening of the human spirit that began in the Italian city-states and spread slowly northward. Artists rediscovered the beauty of the human form, painting saints and Madonnas with faces drawn from life, with emotions that felt real and immediate. Scholars turned their attention to the texts of ancient Greece and Rome, translations that had been preserved by Arab scholars while Europe slumbered. In these classical works, they found a different way of thinking, a tradition that valued reason, rhetoric, philosophy. Plato and Aristotle had asked questions about justice, about virtue, about the nature of reality itself. And they had done so without reference to Christian doctrine, because they had lived centuries before Christ walked the earth. Here was proof that the human mind, unaided by revelation, could achieve greatness. The printing press arrived in the middle of the 15th century, and though few realized it at the time, the world would never be the same. Johannes Gutenberg's invention was simple in concept, but revolutionary in effect. Suddenly, books could be produced not one at a time, but by the hundreds, by the thousands. Ideas that had once been confined to a handful of scholars could now spread across cities, across nations. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517. Challenging the corruption of the Catholic Church, and within weeks, copies of his words were being read in every corner of Germany. The Reformation that followed shattered the religious unity of Europe, but it did something else as well. It established a principle that would prove more explosive than any theological dispute, the principle that individuals could interpret Scripture for themselves, that they did not need priests or bishops to mediate between them and God. This was a radical idea, more radical perhaps than even Luther intended. If you could read the Bible and decide for yourself what it meant, then you possessed a kind of authority that had previously belonged only to the Church. And if you possessed that authority in matters of faith, might you not also possess it in other areas? Might you not be capable of thinking for yourself about justice, about government, about the natural world? The 16th century unfolded with a strange mixture of brilliance and brutality. Europe was tearing itself apart over questions of faith, and the wars of religion that followed the Reformation were merciless. Catholic and Protestant armies marched across the continent, leaving devastation in their wake. Villages were burned, cities were besieged, and neighbor turned against neighbor over interpretations of doctrine that to an outside observer might have seemed vanishingly small. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618 and dragged on until 1648, reduced vast stretches of Central Europe to wasteland. Some regions lost half their population to violence, starvation, and disease. It was a horror that called into question everything that religion claimed to offer: peace, salvation, meaning. Yet even in the midst of this chaos, the human capacity for wonder persisted. While armies clashed over theology, a quieter revolution was taking place in the minds of a few curious individuals scattered across Europe. These were people who looked at the world not with the eyes of faith alone, but with the eyes of observation. They asked not what Scripture said about the natural world, but what the natural world itself might reveal if examined carefully, patiently, systematically. Consider Nicolaus Copernicus, a Polish astronomer who spent years studying the movements of the planets. The established view, inherited from the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy and endorsed by the Church, held that the Earth stood motionless at the center of the universe while everything else revolved around it. This geocentric model fit comfortably with Scripture and with common sense. After all, we do not feel the Earth moving beneath our feet. But Copernicus noticed something troubling. The mathematical calculations required to make the geocentric model work were becoming increasingly complex, increasingly awkward. Astronomers had to add epicycles upon epicycles, wheels within wheels, to account for the observed movements of the planets. What if, Copernicus wondered, the model itself was wrong? What if the sun, not the Earth, stood at the center? When he worked out the mathematics of a heliocentric system, everything became simpler, more elegant. The planets moved in their orbits with a harmony that the old model had never achieved. Copernicus was cautious. He knew the danger of his ideas. He waited until he was on his deathbed to publish his great work on the revolutions of the celestial spheres in 1543, and even then, his followers added a preface suggesting that the heliocentric model was merely a mathematical convenience, not a description of physical reality. But the idea was out in the world now, and it could not be taken back. It whispered a possibility that was deeply unsettling to the established order. What if the universe was not arranged the way we had always assumed? What if our position was not special, not central? What if we were merely one planet among several, orbiting an ordinary star in an unimaginably vast cosmos? Decades later, an Italian mathematician named Galileo Galilei turned a newly invented instrument called the telescope toward the night sky. And what he saw confirmed Copernicus's theory in ways that could not be denied. He saw mountains on the moon, proving that celestial bodies were not perfect spheres of ethereal substance, but worlds of rock and shadow like our own. He saw 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, demonstrating that not everything in the heavens revolved around the Earth. He saw the phases of Venus, which made sense only if Venus orbited the Sun. Galileo published his findings, and the Church took notice. In 1633, he was summoned before the Inquisition and forced to recant, to declare that the Earth did not move. Legend says that as he left the trial, he muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves." Whether or not he actually spoke those words, they capture something essential about this moment in history. Truth, once glimpsed, does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient or forbidden. While astronomers were reimagining the heavens, others were exploring the hidden structures of life itself. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish physician, conducted meticulous dissections of human cadavers and published detailed anatomical drawings that corrected centuries of errors, inherited from the ancient physician Galen. William Harvey traced the circulation of blood through the body, demonstrating that the heart was a pump and that blood moved in a continuous cycle rather than being consumed by the organs as had long been believed. These might seem like narrow, technical discoveries, but they represented something profound. They showed that the human body, like the heavens above, operated according to principles that could be discovered through careful observation and experimentation. And yet, for all these advances, the medieval worldview still held sway over most of Europe. The new ideas circulated among a small network of scholars and natural philosophers, but the average person's life remained largely unchanged. Superstition and folk belief still governed much of daily existence. When crops failed, it was because of witches or because God was displeased. When plague struck, it was divine punishment. Comets were omens of disaster. The phases of the moon influenced everything from planting schedules to medical treatments. Magic and science were not yet clearly distinguished. Even serious scholars might consult astrological charts or search for the philosopher's stone that could turn lead into gold. The 17th century dawned with Europe still caught between two worlds. One foot remained planted firmly in the medieval past, where authority and tradition dictated truth. The other foot reached tentatively toward something new, something that did not yet have a name but could be felt stirring in the air like the approach of a distant storm. The universities, those ancient institutions that had stood for centuries as bastions of learning, were still teaching largely from texts written 1,000 years earlier. Aristotle's physics, though increasingly at odds with observation, remained the foundation of natural philosophy. Students memorized, debated, and defended positions not because evidence supported them, but because they had been handed down through generations of scholars. To question the ancients was to question the very structure of knowledge itself. Yet outside the university walls, a different kind of inquiry was taking shape. In private laboratories and workshops, individuals were conducting experiments, building instruments, testing hypotheses. They were developing what we would now recognize as the scientific method, though they did not call it that. They observed phenomena carefully. They formed tentative explanations. They tested those explanations through experimentation. And when the results contradicted their expectations, they revised their theories rather than clinging to them. This was a fundamentally new way of approaching truth, one that valued evidence over authority, discovery over tradition. René Descartes, a French philosopher and mathematician, embodied this transitional moment perfectly. He had been educated by Jesuits, trained in the classical tradition, yet he found himself deeply unsatisfied with what he had been taught. Too much of it seemed uncertain, built on foundations that crumbled under examination. And so, in the winter of 1619, Descartes retreated to a small room heated by a single stove, and there he undertook a radical experiment. He would doubt everything. Every belief, every assumption, every piece of knowledge he thought he possessed, he would subject to the most rigorous skepticism. Could he trust his senses? No, for they sometimes deceived him. Could he trust mathematics? Perhaps even mathematical truths were illusions. Could he trust that he was awake and not dreaming? How could he be certain? Descartes pushed his doubt to its absolute limit until he arrived at something he could not doubt, the fact that he was doubting. To doubt, one must think. To think, one must exist. And so he reached his famous conclusion, cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. From this single, unshakable certainty, Descartes attempted to rebuild the entire edifice of knowledge, this time on a foundation that could withstand any skeptical assault. His project was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, and not all of his conclusions have survived the scrutiny of later centuries. But what mattered was the method itself, the willingness to question everything, to accept nothing on authority alone, to trust in the power of human reason to discover truth. Across the English Channel, another kind of revolution was quietly unfolding. Francis Bacon, a lawyer and statesman, was arguing for a new approach to understanding nature. Rather than beginning with grand philosophical principles and deducing conclusions from them, Bacon proposed that knowledge should be built from the ground up through careful observation and experiment. Collect facts, test hypotheses, draw conclusions gradually, inductively from accumulated evidence. Bacon envisioned a collaborative enterprise, a community of investigators working together to unlock the secrets of nature for the benefit of all humanity. Knowledge, he insisted, was power, not power for its own sake, but power to improve the human condition, to alleviate suffering, to master the forces of nature that had for so long mastered us. These ideas might have remained confined to philosophical treatises had it not been for the fact that they produced results. Isaac Newton, born in 1642, the same year Galileo died, would bring the scientific revolution to its culmination. Newton was a man of extraordinary genius and equally extraordinary peculiarity. He was obsessive, solitary, prone to fits of melancholy and periods of feverish productivity. He studied alchemy and biblical prophecy alongside mathematics and physics. He quarreled bitterly with rivals and guarded his discoveries jealously. Yet when he finally published his Principia Mathematica in 1687, it was as if a veil had been lifted from the universe. Newton demonstrated that the same force that caused an apple to fall from a tree also held the moon in its orbit around the Earth and the planets, in their paths around the sun. Gravity was universal, operating according to a precise mathematical law that could be expressed in a single elegant equation. The heavens and the earth, which had been thought to operate according to entirely different principles, were revealed to be part of a unified system. With Newton's laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation, one could predict the movements of celestial bodies with astonishing accuracy. The universe, it turned out, was not capricious or mysterious. It was a mechanism, vast and intricate, but ultimately comprehensible to the human mind. The impact of Newton's achievement cannot be overstated. Here was proof, undeniable and mathematically rigorous, that nature operated according to laws that could be discovered through reason and observation. If the heavens themselves could be understood, what else might yield to human inquiry? What other mysteries might be unlocked? The success of physics inspired thinkers in every field to apply similar methods to their own domains. If nature was governed by laws, might society also be governed by laws? Might there be natural laws of economics, of politics, of human behavior itself? The success of natural philosophy, what we would now call science, began to shift something fundamental in the European consciousness. For centuries, humanity had understood itself primarily through the lens of religion. Life was a pilgrimage, a test, a preparation for the world to come. Suffering was to be endured, even embraced, as a means of purifying the soul. The afterlife mattered infinitely more than this brief, painful existence on earth. But now, a different perspective was emerging. If the universe operated according to discoverable laws, if human reason was capable of unlocking nature's secrets, then perhaps this life, this world, mattered more than had been previously imagined. Perhaps humanity was not meant merely to endure existence, but to improve it, to shape it, to bend it toward human flourishing. This shift was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like the turning of seasons. But by the late 17th century, it was undeniable. In coffeehouses and salons, in universities and private correspondence, a new kind of conversation was taking place. People were beginning to ask questions that their grandparents would never have thought to ask. What is the best form of government? How should society be organized? What rights do individuals possess simply by virtue of being human? These were not theological questions. They were political, social, philosophical questions, and they demanded answers drawn from reason and experience rather than scripture and tradition. England, in particular, became a crucible for these new ideas, shaped in part by its own tumultuous history. The English Civil War of the 1640s had seen a king beheaded, a brief experiment with republican government, and then the restoration of the monarchy. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had established the principle that even kings ruled with the consent of Parliament, that power was not absolute but limited by law. These were not merely political events. They were demonstrations that government was a human creation, subject to human judgment, capable of being reformed or replaced when it failed to serve its purpose. John Locke, an English philosopher who lived through these turbulent times, began to articulate a theory of government that would echo across centuries. He started with a simple question: where does political authority come from? The traditional answer, endorsed by kings and churches alike, was that authority flowed from God, that monarchs ruled by divine right, and that to resist them was to resist God himself. But Locke proposed something radically different. He argued that in a state of nature, before governments existed, all human beings were free and equal. They possessed natural rights, the right to life, to liberty, to property, simply by virtue of being human. Government, Locke insisted, was not imposed from above by divine decree. It was created from below by the consent of the governed, for the purpose of protecting these natural rights. And if a government failed in that purpose, if it became tyrannical or abusive, then the people had not merely the right but the duty to alter or abolish it and institute new government more likely to secure their safety and happiness. These ideas were dynamite wrapped in careful philosophical prose. If Locke was right, then kings ruled not by the grace of God, but by the tolerance of their subjects. Authority was conditional, revocable. The social order was not sacred and eternal, but contingent and open to revision. Reading Locke, one could begin to imagine a world organized along entirely different lines, a world where freedom was not a privilege granted by rulers, but a birthright claimed by citizens. Yet even as these revolutionary ideas circulated among intellectuals, the vast majority of Europe remained locked in older patterns. Monarchs still ruled most nations with absolute or near absolute power. The Church, though weakened by the Reformation and challenged by new ideas, still shaped the rhythms of life for millions. Social hierarchies remained rigid. You were born into a station, peasant, merchant, noble, and you died in that station. The idea that an individual might rise or fall based on merit, on talent, on effort, was foreign to a world where birth determined destiny. And beneath all the philosophy and all the science, beneath the glittering achievements of the few, life for most people remained hard, uncertain, and short. Disease was ever present. Infant mortality was staggering. Perhaps half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Famine could strike without warning when harvests failed. Medicine was primitive, often doing more harm than good. Pain was simply a fact of existence, to be borne with whatever fortitude one could muster. The average person could expect to live perhaps 30 or 40 years if fortune smiled, less if it did not. Yet for all this hardship, For all the suffering and inequality and injustice that characterized this age, something remarkable was happening. The human mind was awakening. The questions being asked, the ideas being explored, the possibilities being imagined, these would not remain confined to books and coffeehouse debates. They would spill out into the world, into politics and society, into revolution and reform. The old order, which had seemed eternal and unshakable, was in fact fragile, held together more by habit and fear than by genuine consent. And once people began to question, once they began to imagine alternatives, once they began to believe that things did not have to be as they had always been, then change became not merely possible but inevitable. The world before the Enlightenment was a world of shadows and constraints, of accepted limitations and unquestioned authorities. But the light was coming. It flickered in laboratories where experiments revealed nature's hidden patterns. It glowed in studies where philosophers dared to ask forbidden questions. It sparked in the minds of individuals who read forbidden books and thought forbidden thoughts. The darkness was deep, yes, but darkness cannot withstand light. And the dawn, though still distant, was beginning to break on the horizon. The men and women who would carry that light forward did not yet know the full power of what they were unleashing. They could not have imagined how thoroughly their ideas would reshape the world. But they knew, with a certainty that burned bright in their hearts, that something profound was beginning. The age of unquestioned authority was ending. The age of reason was about to begin. End of chapter 1. And so the stage was set. The old world, weary and crumbling, stood on the threshold of transformation. In the next chapter, we will meet the thinkers who would step through that threshold, who would wield reason like a torch and carry it into every corner of human existence. The spark had been lit. Now it would become a flame. Chapter 2. The Spark of Reason. The 18th century arrived with a sense of possibility hanging in the air like morning mist. Europe was changing, slowly but unmistakably. The wars of religion had exhausted themselves, leaving behind a landscape scarred, but also strangely open. The old certainties had been shaken. The absolute authority of church and crown had been questioned, challenged, and in some places, successfully resisted. And into this opening stepped a new generation of thinkers, men and women who believed that human reason, properly applied, could illuminate every corner of existence. They did not call themselves Enlightenment philosophers at first. That label would come later, applied by historians looking backward. But they knew they were part of something larger than themselves, a movement, an awakening, a collective effort to drag humanity out of what they saw as centuries of darkness and superstition into the clear light of rational understanding. These thinkers were scattered across Europe, from Edinburgh to Naples, from London to Berlin, yet they formed a kind of invisible community, bound together by correspondence and conversation, by shared books and shared ideals. They wrote letters to one another, sometimes traveling for weeks across dangerous roads to reach their destinations. They published essays and treatises that circulated through an expanding network of readers. They gathered in coffeehouses and salons, those remarkable institutions where ideas flowed as freely as wine, where a clever argument mattered more than noble birth, where the hierarchy of the outside world temporarily dissolved in the democracy of debate. At the heart of this movement was a deceptively simple conviction that reason was humanity's most precious gift, the faculty that distinguished us from animals and connected us to truth. Reason was not the monopoly of priests or kings or scholars. Every human being possessed it, at least in potential. And if properly cultivated, If freed from the chains of prejudice and superstition and blind obedience to authority, reason could solve any problem, answer any question, improve any condition. This was not arrogance, or at least it did not feel like arrogance to those who held this belief. It felt like liberation. For centuries, humanity had been told that certain questions were beyond our capacity, that some truths were accessible only through revelation, that our role was to accept and obey rather than to question and discover. Now, finally, the human mind was claiming its rightful inheritance. René Descartes had planted seeds with his methodical doubt, his insistence on accepting nothing that could not be clearly and distinctly perceived. But it was in the decades following his death that those seeds truly began to flourish. John Locke took Descartes' emphasis on individual reason and applied it not just to epistemology, but to politics, to education, to the very structure of society. His essay concerning human understanding, published in 1689, argued that the mind at birth was a blank slate, a tabula rasa, written upon by experience. There were no innate ideas planted by God or inherited from ancestors. Everything we know, everything we believe, comes to us through our senses, through our interactions with the world. This might sound like a technical philosophical point, but its implications were staggering. If the mind was shaped entirely by experience, then human nature itself was not fixed. People were not inherently sinful or inherently virtuous. They became what their environment, their education, their circumstances made them, which meant that if you changed those conditions, you could change humanity itself. This was a vision of almost unlimited possibility and also of profound responsibility. If people were products of their environment, then those who shaped that environment, parents, teachers, rulers, bore the weight of forming human character. Bad institutions produced bad people. Unjust societies created vice and misery. But good institutions, wise laws, proper education, these could create virtue, happiness, flourishing. The project of the Enlightenment, then, was not merely to understand the world, but to remake it, to construct social arrangements that aligned with reason and nature rather than with tradition and power. Across the Channel in France, a different sensibility was emerging, one more combative, more radical, more willing to wield satire and ridicule as weapons against the established order. Voltaire, born Francois-Marie Arouet in 1694, became the embodiment of this spirit. He was a playwright, a poet, a historian, a philosopher, and above all, a controversialist who delighted in provoking those in power. Voltaire had witnessed firsthand the absurdities and injustices of the old regime. He had been imprisoned in the Bastille for writing verses that offended the nobility. He had been beaten by the servants of a nobleman he had insulted, and when he demanded justice, he discovered that justice was not available to someone of his non-noble birth. These experiences left him with a burning contempt for arbitrary authority and a fierce commitment to fighting what he called l'infâme, the infamous thing, by which he meant the combination of religious intolerance, superstition, and institutional tyranny that plagued European society. Voltaire's weapon was his pen, and he wielded it with devastating precision. His prose sparkled with wit. His arguments cut through pretension like a blade. He did not write dense philosophical treatises meant only for specialists. He wrote novels, plays, pamphlets, and essays that ordinary educated readers could understand and enjoy. His Candide, published in 1759, was a savage satire of philosophical optimism, following the misadventures of a naive young man who clings to the belief that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, even as he encounters war, earthquake, slavery, and every form of human cruelty imaginable. The book was funny, shocking, and profoundly subversive. It suggested that the world was not a divinely ordered masterpiece, but a chaotic mess, and that the only reasonable response was to ignore grand metaphysical systems and focus instead on practical improvements to, as the book famously concludes, cultivate our garden. Voltaire's influence extended far beyond his written works. He became a symbol, a living embodiment of the Enlightenment spirit, admired by some and despised by others, but impossible to ignore. Kings and emperors corresponded with him, seeking his approval even as their censors banned his books. He spent years in exile, moving from country to escape persecution, yet his ideas traveled faster than any attempt to suppress them. He championed causes that seemed lost, defending victims of religious persecution, arguing for legal reforms, demanding that torture be abolished and that justice be applied equally regardless of birth or wealth. He did not always succeed. The world was slow to change, resistant to reason, stubbornly attached to its ancient prejudices. But Voltaire never stopped fighting, never stopped writing, never stopped believing that words could change minds and minds could change the world. If Voltaire was the Enlightenment's great warrior, then Jean-Jacques Rousseau was its troubled conscience. Born in Geneva in 1712, Rousseau came from humble origins and never quite fit into the polite society of the salons where other philosophers gathered. He was prickly, paranoid, prone to quarrels with friends and patrons. Yet his writings possessed an emotional power that other Enlightenment thinkers could not match. Where Locke and Voltaire emphasized reason, Rousseau emphasized feeling. Where they celebrated progress and civilization, Rousseau questioned whether these had truly made humanity happier. His discourse on the origin of inequality, published in 1755, painted a picture of primitive humans living in a state of natural freedom and simplicity, uncorrupted by the artificial distinctions and competitive anxieties of civilized life. Property, Rousseau argued, was the source of all inequality. The moment someone fenced off a piece of land and declared, "This is mine," and others were foolish enough to accept that claim, true equality was lost forever. Rousseau's vision was deeply romantic, even nostalgic, yet it contained a radical critique of the society around him. If inequality was not natural but created by human institutions, then it could be abolished by different institutions. If civilization had corrupted humanity, then perhaps humanity could be redeemed through new forms of social organization. His social contract, published in 1762, opened with one of the most famous lines in political philosophy: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." How had this happened? And more importantly, how might humanity throw off those chains and establish a society based on genuine freedom? Rousseau's answer was complex and often misunderstood, but at its core was a vision of democratic self-governance, where laws reflected the general will of the people rather than the particular interests of rulers. This was not democracy as ancient Athens had practiced it, nor as modern nations would eventually implement it, but something more radical, a vision of collective sovereignty where the people were both rulers and ruled, both authors of the law and subjects to it. Rousseau's ideas made other Enlightenment thinkers uncomfortable. They seemed to threaten the very foundations of civilization that those thinkers were trying to perfect. But Rousseau's emphasis on equality, on popular sovereignty, on the corruption inherent in existing institutions would prove enormously influential. When revolution came to France later in the century, Rousseau's writings would be invoked constantly. His vision of the social contract interpreted and reinterpreted to justify radical transformations of society. Meanwhile, in Scotland, a quieter but equally profound revolution was taking place. David Hume, born in Edinburgh in 1711, applied the principles of empiricism, the philosophy that all knowledge comes from experience, with a rigor that led to deeply unsettling conclusions. If we can only know what we observe through our senses, Hume argued, then many of the things we take for granted cannot actually be known with certainty. We cannot prove that the future will resemble the past. We cannot demonstrate the existence of the self as anything more than a bundle of perceptions. We cannot establish causation as anything beyond a habit of mind formed by observing constant conjunction. Even the existence of God, which other Enlightenment thinkers tended to accept as a foundation for morality and meaning, could not be proven through reason or experience. Hume's skepticism was so thorough that it threatened to undermine the very Enlightenment project he was part of. If reason could not establish certain knowledge, if our most basic beliefs about reality were merely habits and assumptions, then what hope was there for the rational reconstruction of society? Yet Hume himself did not sink into despair. He accepted the limits of human knowledge with equanimity and turned his attention to questions that could be addressed through careful observation and analysis. His History of England became a bestseller, demonstrating that historical events could be understood through natural causes rather than divine providence. His essays on politics and economics offered insights drawn from studying human nature and social behavior. And his exploration of morality suggested that ethics was not a matter of abstract reasoning, but of sentiment, of the feelings of sympathy and approval that naturally arise in social beings. Hume's friend Adam Smith took these insights and applied them to the emerging science of political economy. Smith had studied moral philosophy and was deeply interested in the question of what held society together. The traditional answer was authority, the power of kings and lords to command obedience. But Smith saw something else at work in the bustling markets and workshops of 18th century Britain. He saw individuals pursuing their own interests, making decisions based on their own knowledge and circumstances, yet somehow without any central direction, producing outcomes that benefited society as a whole. A baker did not bake bread out of benevolence, but because he wanted to earn a living. A farmer did not grow wheat out of concern for strangers, but because he could sell it for profit. Yet through this apparently selfish behavior, guided by what Smith called the invisible hand of market forces, society was fed, goods were produced, prosperity increased. Smith's masterwork, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, was not merely a treatise on economics. It was a vision of how human societies could organize themselves without the heavy hand of government control, how individual liberty and collective prosperity could align, how the pursuit of self-interest, properly channeled through markets and competition, could serve the common good. Smith was not naive about this. He recognized that merchants would collude to raise prices if they could, that monopolies were dangerous, that workers needed protection from exploitation. But he believed that free exchange, voluntary cooperation, and competition offered a better path to prosperity than the intricate regulations and mercantilist policies that most governments imposed. What united these diverse thinkers, Locke and Voltaire, Rousseau and Hume, Smith and countless others, was not a single doctrine or a unified philosophy. They disagreed vigorously with one another on fundamental questions, but they shared a commitment to certain principles. They believed that human beings were capable of understanding the world through observation and reason. They believed that existing institutions and traditions should be judged not by their antiquity or their claimed divine sanction, but by their actual effects on human welfare. They believed that criticism was necessary, that challenging authority was not merely permissible but essential, that progress was possible if only humanity would cast off the superstitions and prejudices that had held it back for so long. This was the spark of reason, and it was spreading. Not quickly, not without resistance, but spreading nonetheless. Books were being published at an unprecedented rate, thanks to improvements in printing technology and expanding literacy. Ideas that might have remained locked in Latin, manuscripts accessible only to scholars, were now being written in vernacular languages, French, English, German, and reaching audiences that previous generations of philosophers could never have imagined. Coffeehouses became informal universities where merchants and craftsmen could read newspapers and pamphlets, debate politics and philosophy, hear about the latest scientific discoveries. Salons, often hosted by educated women, created spaces where conversation flourished, where wit and intelligence mattered more than rank or title. Women played a crucial but often underappreciated role in the Enlightenment. Excluded from universities and most formal institutions of learning, they nonetheless found ways to participate in the intellectual ferment of the age. Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV, was a patron of artists and philosophers, using her influence at court to protect Enlightenment figures from censorship. Madame du Châtelet was a brilliant mathematician and physicist who translated Newton's Principia into French, adding her own commentary that clarified and extended his arguments. Her work made Newton's ideas accessible to French readers and established her as a serious scholar in her own right, though she had to fight constantly against prejudices that dismissed women as incapable of rigorous thought. Mary Wollstonecraft, born in England in 1759, would eventually turn the principles of the Enlightenment against the very men who articulated them. If all human beings possessed reason, if everyone deserved freedom and equality, then why were women excluded from education, from property rights, from political participation? Her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, argued that women appeared inferior to men not because of any natural deficiency, but because they were systematically denied the education and opportunities that would allow their abilities to flourish. Give women the same training as men, Wollstonecraft insisted, and they would prove equally capable. The subjection of women was not ordained by nature or God, but was simply one more irrational prejudice that reason must sweep away. Yet even as these ideas circulated and inspired, they faced fierce opposition. The Catholic Church, in particular, viewed the Enlightenment as a mortal threat. The emphasis on reason over revelation, the questioning of traditional authority, the casual dismissal of miracles and mysteries, all of this struck at the heart of Catholic teaching. Books by Enlightenment authors were placed on the index of forbidden books. Philosophers were threatened with excommunication. In some Catholic countries, possessing certain texts could result in imprisonment. The Church understood, perhaps better than the philosophers themselves, that ideas have consequences, that once people begin to think for themselves, the old structures of authority become difficult to maintain. Protestant countries were somewhat more tolerant, though not uniformly so. In England and the Netherlands, there was more space for debate and dissent, but even there, limits existed. Atheism was beyond the pale. Challenges to fundamental moral norms met with harsh punishment. The Enlightenment thinkers themselves were often cautious, using pseudonyms, publishing anonymously, circulating manuscripts privately before risking public exposure. Voltaire published Candide without his name on it, and when authorities figured out who had written it, the book was promptly banned. But banning a book in the 18th century was like trying to stop water from flowing downhill. Copies multiplied. Underground editions appeared. Translations spread the work to other countries. The very act of censorship often made a book more desirable, more widely read than it would have been otherwise. And beneath all the philosophical debates, beneath the grand theories about human nature and social organization, something else was happening. Science continued its steady advance. Benjamin Franklin flew a kite in a thunderstorm and demonstrated that lightning was electricity, not the wrath of God. Antoine Lavoisier conducted careful experiments that established chemistry as a rigorous discipline, showing that matter was neither created nor destroyed, but only transformed. Carolus Linnaeus developed a system for classifying living things, bringing order to the bewildering diversity of nature. Each of these discoveries reinforced the Enlightenment conviction that the universe operated according to rational principles, that mystery was simply ignorance waiting to be dispelled by investigation. The pace of change was accelerating, though it often went unnoticed by those living through it. A person born in 1700 and living until 1780 would have witnessed a transformation in the intellectual landscape more profound than anything seen in the previous 1,000 years. Ideas that would have been unthinkable heresy at the beginning of the century were being openly discussed, debated, and in some cases implemented by the end of it. Governments were beginning, tentatively, to embrace certain Enlightenment principles. Torture was being abolished in some jurisdictions. Legal codes were being rationalized. Censorship, though still widespread, was becoming harder to enforce as the sheer volume of printed material overwhelmed the censor's capacity to control it. The Enlightenment was not, however, a purely European phenomenon, though it began there. Its ideas traveled across oceans, carried by ships and letters, by merchants and missionaries, by colonists and explorers. In the American colonies, Enlightenment thought found particularly fertile ground. Men like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison were steeped in the works of Locke, Montesquieu, and the Scottish philosophers. They read voraciously, corresponded with European thinkers, and applied Enlightenment principles to the practical problems of governance. When tensions with Britain escalated into revolution, it was Enlightenment philosophy that provided the intellectual foundation for independence. Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, drafted in 1776, reads like a distillation of Enlightenment thought. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It begins, appealing not to scripture or tradition, but to reason itself. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here was Locke's theory of natural rights, rendered in prose so clear and compelling that it would echo across centuries. And the Declaration went further, asserting that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. This was revolutionary, not merely as a political act, but as a philosophical statement. It declared that reason and natural rights, not divine ordination or ancient custom, were the proper foundations for government. Yet the American Revolution also exposed the contradictions and limitations of Enlightenment thought. Jefferson wrote eloquently about equality and unalienable rights while himself enslaving hundreds of human beings. The founders created a republic based on consent of the governed, but excluded women, enslaved people, and indigenous peoples from political participation. They spoke of universal human rights yet practiced systematic oppression. This was not mere hypocrisy, though hypocrisy was certainly present. It was something more troubling, a failure or unwillingness to extend the logic of their own principles to all human beings. The Enlightenment's bright light cast shadows, and in those shadows, terrible injustices persisted. Back in Europe, enlightened despots were attempting their own experiments with rational governance. Frederick the Great of Prussia fashioned himself a philosopher king, corresponding with Voltaire, abolishing torture, promoting education and religious tolerance, all while maintaining absolute power and pursuing aggressive military expansion. Catherine the Great of Russia invited Diderot to her court, purchased his library, and spoke admiringly of Enlightenment ideals, even as she expanded serfdom and crushed dissent. Joseph II of Austria implemented sweeping reforms, abolishing serfdom, granting religious freedom, centralizing administration, with such speed and thoroughness that he provoked resistance from nobles and peasants alike. These rulers demonstrated both the promise and the peril of trying to impose reason from above. Reform without consent, even when well-intentioned, often generated more resentment than gratitude. Perhaps the most ambitious intellectual project of the entire Enlightenment was the Encyclopédie, edited by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert. Published in France between 1751 and 1772, it was intended to be nothing less than a comprehensive compendium of human knowledge, covering everything from science and philosophy to trades and crafts. The Encyclopédie was not merely informational. It was ideological, subtly, and sometimes not so subtly promoting Enlightenment values. Articles on religion questioned traditional dogmas. Entries on politics challenged absolute monarchy. Descriptions of manufacturing processes elevated practical knowledge and the dignity of labor. The work faced constant harassment from authorities. Volumes were seized. Publication was suspended. Contributors were threatened. Yet Diderot persevered, driven by a vision of making knowledge accessible, of breaking the monopoly that elites held over learning, of empowering readers to think for themselves. The Encyclopédie became a symbol of the Enlightenment itself, ambitious, optimistic, sometimes naive, occasionally infuriating, but animated by a genuine belief that humanity could improve itself through the systematic application of reason. It was purchased by nobles and bourgeoisie across Europe, read in salons and libraries, cited in debates and correspondence. It represented the conviction that knowledge was not static, handed down from ancient authorities, but dynamic, growing through investigation and debate. As the 18th century moved toward its final decades, the mood of the Enlightenment began to shift. The early optimism, the breezy confidence that reason would inevitably triumph over superstition, started to give way to something more complex. Rousseau's dark warnings about civilization's corrupting effects resonated with those who felt that progress had not brought the promised happiness. Hume's skepticism about reason's power to establish certain knowledge troubled those who had built their entire worldview on rational foundations. And the persistent resistance to reform, the seemingly endless capacity of human beings to cling to prejudice and privilege, even in the face of overwhelming argument, suggested that changing minds was harder than the early Enlightenment thinkers had imagined. Yet the spark had been lit, and it would not be extinguished. The ideas that had seemed so radical at the beginning of the century, that government should serve the people rather than the reverse, that all human beings possessed fundamental rights, that tradition was not sacred, that questions should be asked and answers demanded. These had seeped into the consciousness of educated Europeans and Americans. They had created expectations that could not be uncreated, demands that could not be silenced, visions of possibility that made the existing order seem increasingly intolerable. The philosophers had done their work. They had questioned authority, challenged tradition, articulated alternatives, imagined different worlds. They had written books and essays and letters. They had debated in salons and coffeehouses. They had risked censorship and exile and persecution. And though many of them died before seeing the full consequences of their ideas, they had set in motion forces that would reshape the world. The spark of reason had caught fire. And now, as the century drew toward its close, that fire was about to leap from the world of ideas into the world of action. What had been debated in comfortable rooms would soon be decided in streets and assemblies. What had been written in books would soon be written into laws and constitutions. The age of philosophy was giving way to the age of revolution. End of chapter 2. The thinkers had spoken. The principles had been articulated. Reason had been championed, authority had been challenged, and new visions of human possibility had been imagined. But ideas alone do not change the world. They must be carried by people, debated in communities, spread across networks of communication and connection. In the next chapter, we will enter the Republic of Letters, that invisible nation of minds united in the project of enlightenment, and we will see how a conversation that began in a few scattered cities grew into a chorus that would be heard around the world. Chapter 3. The Republic of Letters. Imagine a nation without borders, a community without walls, a republic where citizenship was granted not by accident of birth but by curiosity, by the willingness to read and write and think and argue. This was the Republic of Letters, an invisible empire that stretched across Europe and reached across oceans to the Americas, binding together thousands of individuals who might never meet face to face, but who nonetheless shared a common project, a common language of inquiry, a common belief that knowledge should flow freely and that conversation, not coercion, was the proper means of discovering truth. It was not a formal institution. No one founded it. No charter defined its principles. Yet by the middle of the 18th century, it was as real as any nation and, in some ways, more powerful, because ideas travel farther and last longer than armies. The infrastructure of this republic was simple but revolutionary. At its heart was the letter, that ancient form of communication that the printing press and improving postal systems had made faster and more reliable. Philosophers and scientists, historians and poets wrote to one another constantly, sometimes dashing off brief notes, sometimes composing lengthy essays that took weeks to complete. These letters crossed mountains and rivers, passed through customs houses and postal stations, sometimes arrived months after being sent, occasionally were lost entirely or intercepted by suspicious authorities. Yet they kept flowing, a constant circulation of ideas and arguments, observations and speculations, gossip and news. When Voltaire wanted to discuss metaphysics, he wrote to Frederick the Great. When Benjamin Franklin had questions about electricity, he corresponded with scientists in London and Paris. When David Hume published a new work, copies were sent to intellectuals across Europe, and within months, responses and critiques were arriving from a dozen different cities. This was not merely exchange of information. It was collaborative thinking, the construction of knowledge through dialogue, the testing of ideas against the scrutiny of brilliant and often merciless critics. To be part of this republic was to accept that your thoughts would be challenged, your assumptions questioned, your mistakes pointed out. But it was also to know that you were part of something larger than yourself, a collective endeavor to push back the boundaries of ignorance. The letter was supplemented by other forms of communication. Journals and periodicals proliferated, publishing essays and reviews and reports on the latest discoveries. The Journal des Savants in France, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in England, dozens of other publications created a constant stream of new material for the curious to consume. These journals were read in libraries and coffeehouses, discussed in salons and societies, summarized and quoted in correspondence. They created a shared intellectual culture, a sense that important things were happening, that knowledge was advancing on multiple fronts, that the attentive reader could keep pace with the latest developments in fields ranging from astronomy to zoology. And then there were the books. Oh, the books! The 18th century was a golden age of publishing. Printing technology had improved, paper had become cheaper, literacy was spreading, and the appetite for reading seemed insatiable. Books on every imaginable subject poured from presses in London, Paris, Amsterdam, Leipzig. Novels and histories, philosophical treatises and travel narratives, scientific works and political pamphlets, they circulated through an expanding network of booksellers, libraries, and private collections. Wealthy individuals assembled enormous libraries, sometimes housing thousands of volumes. Lending libraries made books accessible to those who could not afford to purchase them. And where official channels failed, underground networks distributed forbidden works, smuggling banned books across borders and selling them in secret to eager readers. The coffeehouse emerged as one of the defining institutions of Enlightenment culture. These establishments, which had begun to appear in European cities in the 17th century, became centers of conversation and debate. For the price of a cup of coffee, a person could spend hours in the company of others, reading newspapers, discussing politics, arguing about philosophy. The coffeehouse was democratic in a way that few other spaces were. A merchant might sit beside a nobleman, a writer beside a scientist, and for the duration of their stay, the only hierarchy that mattered was the quality of one's arguments. Wit and knowledge commanded respect regardless of the social position of the person displaying them. In London, coffee houses became associated with particular professions or interests. Lawyers gathered at one, merchants at another, literary figures at a third. The insurance market at Lloyd's of London began as conversations in a coffee house. The Royal Society, England's premier scientific organization, drew many of its members from the coffee houses where natural philosophers discussed their latest experiments. In Paris, the Café Procope became a gathering place for philosophes, a term the French used to describe Enlightenment intellectuals. Voltaire held court there, Diderot debated there, and countless others came to see and be seen, to participate in the great conversation that seemed to be reshaping European thought. The salon offered a more intimate and often more refined setting for intellectual exchange. These were gatherings, usually held in private homes, where invited guests would discuss literature, philosophy, science, and politics. What made the salons distinctive was that they were often organized and presided over by women. In a society that excluded women from universities and most formal institutions, the salon became a space where educated women could exercise intellectual influence. A successful salonier needed social grace, wide knowledge, and the ability to guide conversation. Encouraging the shy, restraining the overbearing, ensuring that discussion remained lively without descending into acrimony. Madame Geoffrin's salon in Paris became legendary, attracting the greatest minds of the age. Every Monday, she hosted artists. Every Wednesday, men of letters gathered around her table. She had a gift for bringing people together, for creating an atmosphere where ideas could be explored without fear of ridicule or censorship. She supported struggling writers, mediated quarrels between rival philosophers, and used her considerable wealth to fund projects she deemed worthwhile. Her influence extended beyond France. When she traveled to Poland, she was received almost as a visiting head of state. So great was her reputation as a patron of learning. Yet she held no official position, commanded no armies, ruled no territory. Her power came entirely from the respect she had earned within the Republic of Letters. Madame du Deffand presided over another influential salon, famous for its brilliant conversation and sharp wit. Despite going blind in middle age, she continued to host gatherings where the most important intellectuals of Paris came to talk and argue late into the night. Her correspondence with Voltaire, with Horace Walpole, with D'Alembert, reveals a mind as sharp and questioning as any of the male philosophers who frequented her home. Julie de Lespinasse, who had been du Deffand's companion, eventually established her own salon, which became known for its intensity and emotional warmth. These women were not merely hosts. They were active participants in the intellectual life of their time, shaping opinions, promoting ideas, challenging arguments. The Republic of Letters was multilingual, though certain languages dominated. Latin, the ancient language of scholarship, was slowly giving way to the modern vernaculars. French became the lingua franca of educated Europeans, spoken and written by intellectuals from Stockholm to Naples, from London to St. Petersburg. The French philosophes wrote with a clarity and elegance that made their works attractive even to readers who disagreed with their conclusions. But English was also widely read, especially works of science and political philosophy. German was emerging as an important intellectual language, particularly in philosophy and theology. And increasingly, works were translated, allowing ideas to cross linguistic boundaries with relative ease. Translation itself became a crucial activity within the Republic of Letters. When Newton's Principia was translated into French, it made his ideas accessible to continental readers who might not have tackled the original Latin. When Voltaire wrote about English philosophy and society in his Letters Philosophiques, he was translating not just words, but entire systems of thought, making British empiricism comprehensible to French readers. Translators were often scholars in their own right, adding footnotes and commentary that clarified obscure references or explained cultural differences. They were mediators between intellectual traditions, building bridges across the divides of language and nation. Learned societies and academies formalized certain aspects of the Republic of Letters. The Royal Society in London, founded in 1660, brought together England's leading scientists and natural philosophers. Its motto, Nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, captured the Enlightenment. Insistence on empirical verification rather than blind acceptance of authority. The Académie Française, established even earlier to regulate the French language, became a prestigious institution whose members were celebrated as guardians of learning. Frederick the Great established the Berlin Academy, drawing scholars from across Europe. These academies provided institutional support for research, published proceedings that disseminated discoveries, and lent prestige to the scientific enterprise. But the Republic of Letters was not only a realm of elite intellectuals and aristocratic patrons. Its reach extended into the growing middle class, the merchants and professionals and skilled craftsmen who had both the literacy and the leisure to participate in intellectual life. Subscription libraries appeared in cities and towns, pooling resources to purchase books that members could borrow. Reading societies formed, where groups would meet regularly to discuss a particular work or debate current controversies. Masonic lodges, which spread rapidly across Europe in the 18th century, often functioned as spaces for intellectual exchange, bringing together men of different social backgrounds in an atmosphere of brotherhood and enlightenment. The Freemasons were particularly interesting as an Enlightenment phenomenon. They claimed ancient origins, linking themselves to the medieval guilds of stonemasons, but in reality, they were a product of the 18th century. Their lodges emphasized reason, tolerance, and the brotherhood of all men regardless of religious or political differences. The rituals and symbols that made Masonry seem mysterious to outsiders were, for members, allegories about the progress from ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light. Many prominent Enlightenment figures were Masons. Voltaire was initiated into a lodge late in life. Benjamin Franklin was a devoted member and helped establish lodges in America. Mozart, whose opera The Magic Flute is filled with Masonic symbolism, found in the lodge a community that shared his commitment to Enlightenment ideals. Yet the Republic of Letters, for all its claims to universality, had clear boundaries. It was predominantly male. While exceptional women like Madame Geoffrin or Emily du Châtelet found ways to participate, they were anomalies in a world that assumed intellectual life was a masculine domain. Women who wanted to pursue learning faced obstacles at every turn. They were excluded from universities, discouraged from studying mathematics or science, mocked if they displayed too much erudition. The very qualities that were praised in men, intellectual ambition, forceful argumentation, wide-ranging curiosity, were considered unfeminine, even dangerous in women. The Republic of Letters was also overwhelmingly European and, within Europe, largely confined to the educated elite. While Enlightenment thinkers spoke of universal reason and natural rights, they often assumed that these applied primarily to people like themselves. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, Africans, Asians, were frequently discussed as objects of study, curiosities to be examined and categorized rather than as fellow citizens of the intellectual republic. Some Enlightenment figures challenged this prejudice. Montesquieu satirized European arrogance in his Persian letters, presenting European customs as strange and arbitrary from the perspective of fictional Persian travelers. Diderot's supplement to Bougainville's voyage questioned whether Europeans had any right to impose their values on Tahitians, but these were minority voices. The dominant assumption was that Europe represented the pinnacle of civilization, and that the Enlightenment was the process by which Europeans had achieved this status. Even slavery, that glaring contradiction to Enlightenment principles, was debated within the Republic of Letters with a troubling ambivalence. Some thinkers condemned it unequivocally. Montesquieu wrote scathingly about the absurdity of arguments used to justify slavery, reducing them to mockery. The Abbé Raynal's History of the Two Indies, a collaborative work involving Diderot and others, attacked colonial exploitation and called slavery a crime against humanity. The Quakers, though not philosophers in the traditional sense, mounted a systematic campaign against slavery based on their belief in the equality of all souls before God. Yet other Enlightenment figures were disturbingly silent, or worse, attempted to rationalize the institution. Some argued that slavery was necessary for economic prosperity. Others suggested that Africans were somehow less fully human, less capable of reason, and therefore suited to servitude. These arguments were not products of ignorance. They were crafted by educated men who knew perfectly well the principles of equality and natural rights, but chose not to extend them universally. This contradiction revealed something important about the Enlightenment. It was not a single, unified movement with a clear and consistent ideology. It was a conversation, sometimes harmonious, often contentious, involving people with very different assumptions and agendas. The Republic of Letters contained genuine radicals who wanted to overturn the existing order completely, moderate reformers who hoped to improve institutions gradually, and cautious conservatives who admired Enlightenment thought in the abstract but resisted its implications for their own societies. What held them together was not agreement but engagement, the shared commitment to debate and discussion, to testing ideas through argument rather than accepting them on authority. The Republic's invisible boundaries were maintained through correspondence networks that could be remarkably exclusive. To be taken seriously as a participant, one needed introductions, recommendations from established figures. A young scholar hoping to enter this world would send his work to a recognized philosopher, hoping for a response, perhaps even an endorsement. Success depended not only on the quality of one's ideas, but also on one's ability to navigate social networks, to win patrons, to avoid offending powerful figures who could make or break a reputation. This was, in its own way, a system of gatekeeping as rigid as any university or academy, though its criteria were different. Yet the system was also remarkably dynamic and meritocratic compared to other aspects of 18th century life. A person born into humble circumstances could, through education and talent, gain entry to intellectual circles that would have been closed to him in the political or social realm. Rousseau, the son of a watchmaker, corresponded with kings and princes. Diderot, whose father was a cutler, became one of the most influential intellectuals in France. Benjamin Franklin, who left school at age 10 to work in his father's candle shop, became celebrated throughout Europe as a scientist and philosopher. The Republic of Letters did not eliminate class distinctions, but it created a space where intellectual merit could sometimes trump social origin. The physical spaces where the Republic of Letters existed were as diverse as its participants. In addition to salons and coffeehouses, there were botanical gardens where naturalists discussed classification systems while examining exotic plants. There were observatories where astronomers shared telescopes and compared observations. There were anatomical theaters where physicians dissected cadavers before audiences of students and curious onlookers. There were cabinets of curiosities, private collections of natural wonders and scientific instruments, which their owners opened to visitors. Each of these spaces facilitated a particular kind of knowledge production and exchange, creating communities of practice around shared interests. Universities, surprisingly, were often peripheral to the most exciting intellectual developments of the Enlightenment. Many universities remained bastions of scholastic tradition, teaching the same texts in the same ways that had been used for centuries. The truly innovative thinking was happening elsewhere in private studies, in correspondence networks, in informal gatherings. When universities did participate in Enlightenment culture, it was often individual professors acting independently rather than the institution as a whole. The University of Edinburgh became associated with Enlightenment thought, largely because of remarkable individuals like Adam Smith and William Robertson, not because the university itself had embraced reform. The printed word remained the primary medium through which the Republic of Letters communicated with the broader public. Pamphlets were particularly important, short enough to be read in a single sitting, cheap enough to be widely affordable, focused enough to address a specific issue or argument. During moments of political crisis, pamphlets appeared by the hundreds, creating a kind of print-based public debate. When the American colonists were debating independence, pamphlets arguing for and against separation from Britain circulated widely. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, sold an estimated 150,000 copies in just a few months, a staggering number that represented perhaps one copy for every 16 colonists. Paine wrote in plain language, avoiding the learned references and classical allusions that characterized much Enlightenment prose. He wanted to reach ordinary people, not just the educated elite, and his success demonstrated that the Republic of Letters could extend its reach far beyond the salon and the coffeehouse. Newspapers, too, played an increasingly important role. The 18th century saw an explosion of newspaper publishing, with dailies and weeklies appearing in every major city. These papers reported news, of course, political developments, commercial information, accounts of wars and disasters. But they also published essays, letters, and reviews that brought Enlightenment ideas to a mass audience. The Spectator, published in London by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele in the early 18th century, aimed explicitly to bring philosophy out of the study and into the coffeehouse. Its essays, written in an accessible and often humorous style, discussed everything from literary criticism to moral philosophy, shaping the tastes and opinions of thousands of readers. The circulation of ideas was not, however, frictionless. Censorship remained a constant challenge for anyone who wished to publish controversial material. In France, the Church and the Crown maintained elaborate systems of control over printing. Books required official approval before publication, and those that criticized religion or government were banned, their authors subject to arrest. Yet the system was porous, almost comically so. Forbidden books were printed in the Netherlands or Switzerland and smuggled across borders. Publishers used false imprints, claiming a book had been printed in Amsterdam or London when it had actually been produced in Paris. Authors published anonymously or pseudonymously, making prosecution difficult. And government officials, even those officially responsible for enforcing censorship, were often sympathetic to Enlightenment ideas and willing to look the other way. Malesherbes, who served as director of the book trade in France, was supposed to suppress dangerous publications. Instead, he warned authors when their works were about to be seized, helped them hide manuscripts, and found ways to license books that technically violated regulations. When the encyclopedia faced suppression, Malesherbes personally arranged for the printing plates and manuscripts to be hidden in his own residence, protecting them from confiscation. He understood that ideas could not be controlled through brute force, that attempting to suppress them often only increased their appeal. This was the paradox of Enlightenment censorship. The very act of banning a book advertised its existence and made it more desirable. The underground book trade became a thriving business. Peddlers carried banned works in their packs, selling them in villages and towns far from the reach of urban censors. Wealthy collectors paid premium prices for rare editions of forbidden texts. Reading clubs shared prohibited books among members, each person keeping a volume for a week or two before passing it along. This clandestine circulation created a sense of conspiracy and excitement around Enlightenment ideas, making readers feel they were part of an intellectual vanguard, brave enough to engage with dangerous thoughts. Yet not all dangerous books were profound philosophical treatises. The underground trade also dealt in pornography, libels, scandalous pamphlets attacking public figures, and sensationalist literature of all kinds. In fact, These often sold better than serious philosophy. Robert Darnton, a historian of 18th century French publishing, discovered that while we remember Voltaire and Rousseau, their contemporaries were equally interested in salacious novels and scurrilous attacks on the royal family. The Enlightenment's expansion of reading created an appetite for all kinds of print, not just the elevated works that would later be canonized as classics. The Republic of Letters existed alongside, and sometimes overlapped with, a broader republic of readers whose tastes were varied and not always refined. Travel, too, facilitated the exchange of ideas. The Grand Tour, a traditional journey undertaken by wealthy young Europeans, typically included stops in Paris, Geneva, Rome, and other cultural centers. These travelers carried books with them, attended salons, visited academies, and met with local intellectuals. They returned home with new ideas, new books, and new connections. James Boswell, who would later become famous as Samuel Johnson's biographer, traveled extensively in Europe as a young man, meeting Rousseau and Voltaire, among others. His journals record not just tourist observations, but intellectual encounters that shaped his thinking. Some intellectuals were perpetual travelers, never quite settling in one place. Voltaire spent years in exile, moving between France, England, Prussia, and Switzerland. Rousseau wandered from Geneva to Paris to England, never finding a home where he felt comfortable. These exiles were sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced, but they had the effect of spreading ideas across borders, creating personal connections that transcended national boundaries. When Voltaire lived in England, he absorbed English philosophy and science, which he then introduced to French readers. When Benjamin Franklin spent years in France as an American diplomat, he became a living embodiment of Enlightenment ideals, celebrated in Parisian salons as the philosopher from the New World. The Republic of Letters also had its institutions devoted to practical improvement. Agricultural societies worked to apply rational methods to farming, testing new crops and techniques. Medical societies promoted inoculation against smallpox, despite fierce resistance from those who saw it as interfering with divine will. Scientific societies funded expeditions to measure the shape of the Earth, to observe the transit of Venus, to map unexplored territories. These endeavors were motivated partly by curiosity, partly by national pride, but also by a genuine belief that knowledge could and should be used to improve human life. The Lunar Society of Birmingham exemplified this practical dimension of Enlightenment culture. Its members, including Erasmus Darwin, Josiah Wedgwood, and James Watt, were scientists, inventors, and industrialists who met monthly to discuss new ideas and innovations. They were not abstract theorists but practical men who applied scientific principles to manufacturing, engineering, and medicine. Wedgwood revolutionized pottery production through systematic experimentation. Watt's improvements to the steam engine would help drive the Industrial Revolution. These men saw no contradiction between intellectual inquiry and commercial success, between philosophy and profit. Knowledge, for them, was meant to be useful, to produce tangible benefits for society. Women continued to find creative ways to participate in this republic, despite the barriers they faced. Some, like Maria Gaetana Agnesi in Italy, achieved recognition as mathematicians through sheer brilliance that could not be ignored. Others, like Laura Bassi, the first woman to earn a university position in Europe, carved out spaces in institutions that had previously been exclusively male. Many more participated through correspondence, through salons, through translation and editing work that allowed them to engage with ideas, even if they could not claim authorship. The letters of Abigail Adams to her husband John reveal a mind every bit as engaged with political philosophy as the founding fathers, though she would never hold office or vote. The Republic of Letters was also a republic of criticism. Its participants subjected one another's work to rigorous scrutiny, often in print and in language that could be harsh. When Rousseau's discourse on inequality appeared, Voltaire wrote to him, "I have received your new book against the human race, and I thank you for it. Never was such cleverness used in the design of making us all stupid. One longs, in reading your book, to walk on all fours." This was not casual conversation. This was intellectual combat, the testing of ideas through the fire of debate. And Rousseau, for his part, gave as good as he got, accusing Voltaire of superficiality and moral corruption. These debates, fierce as they could be, were nonetheless governed by certain unwritten rules. Arguments should be based on reason and evidence, not on appeals to authority or tradition. Personal attacks, while common, were supposed to be distinguished from intellectual critique. And above all, the conversation should continue. Disagreement was not a failure to be avoided, but an opportunity to refine ideas, to expose weaknesses, to arrive at better understanding. The Republic of Letters thrived on controversy, on the clash of perspectives, on the restless questioning that refused to accept any conclusion as final. Yet there were limits to this tolerance. Those who questioned fundamental principles too radically found themselves marginalized or worse. Atheism remained beyond the pale for most Enlightenment thinkers, who saw belief in God as necessary for morality and social order, even if they rejected traditional religious doctrines. Materialism, the view that nothing exists except matter and that even thought is merely a physical process, was treated with suspicion and often hostility. When the French physician Julien Offray de la Mettrie published Man a Machine, arguing that humans were essentially complex machines without souls, he was driven into exile and died in disgrace. The Republic of Letters had boundaries, invisible but real, and those who crossed them paid a price. As the 18th century progressed, the Republic of Letters began to fragment, or perhaps to multiply. What had started as a relatively small community of correspondents became too large, too diverse, too specialized to function as a single entity. Scientific disciplines were becoming more technical, developing specialized vocabularies that made them inaccessible to general readers. Political philosophy was diverging into competing schools of thought. National intellectual cultures were asserting their distinctiveness. The German Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, emphasized philosophy and theology in ways that distinguished it from the French focus on social criticism. The Scottish Enlightenment developed its own character, more empirical and historical than continental philosophy. The Italian Enlightenment grappled with questions of legal reform and economic development in contexts quite different from those facing Northern Europe. Yet even as it fragmented, the Republic of Letters continued to function as a network, a web of connections that allowed ideas to flow across boundaries. A discovery made in Edinburgh would be discussed in Berlin within months. A political crisis in America would be analyzed in Paris almost immediately. The Republic had become too large and complex to be governed by a few saloniers and celebrated philosophes. But it had also become more resilient, more distributed, less dependent on any particular individuals or institutions. It was, in a sense, preparing for the democratic age that would follow, when public opinion, rather than elite conversation, would become the arbiter of ideas. The legacy of the Republic of Letters would extend far beyond the 18th century. It established the principle that knowledge should be freely exchanged, that intellectual merit mattered more than social status, that criticism was essential to progress. It created institutions, learned societies, journals, public libraries that would outlast the Enlightenment itself. It demonstrated that conversation across borders and differences was possible. That reason could serve as a common language even among people who disagreed about almost everything else. But perhaps most importantly, the Republic of Letters expanded the community of people who saw themselves as capable of thinking about fundamental questions. It took philosophy out of the monastery and the university and brought it into the coffeehouse and the parlor. It suggested that anyone who could read and reason had a right to participate in the great conversations about truth, justice, beauty, and the good life. This democratization of intellectual life was incomplete, certainly. It excluded more people than it included. But the principle had been established, the door had been opened, and it would prove impossible to close again. As the 1780s arrived, the conversations within the Republic of Letters were becoming more urgent, more politically charged. The questions that had seemed purely theoretical about the origins of government, the rights of individuals, the legitimacy of authority were beginning to demand practical answers. In America, a new nation was being born, attempting to put Enlightenment principles into practice. In France, financial crisis was forcing even the most resistant monarchy to consider reforms. Throughout Europe, pressures were building, tensions were rising, contradictions were becoming unsustainable. The age of conversation was about to give way to the age of action. The Republic of Letters had done its work. It had connected minds, circulated ideas, tested arguments, built networks of communication and solidarity. It had created a sense that intellectuals across Europe and beyond shared a common project, that they were participants in a great awakening of human potential. They had questioned everything that previous generations had taken for granted. They had imagined alternatives to every form of tyranny and injustice. They had articulated principles of freedom, equality, and reason with a clarity and force that could not be ignored. And now, as the century drew toward its tumultuous conclusion, those ideas were about to escape the confines of letters and books and salons. They were about to enter the streets, the assemblies, the battlefields. They were about to change the world, not through persuasion alone, but through revolution. The invisible empire of the mind was about to collide with the visible empires of power. And in that collision, the modern world would be born. End of Chapter 3. The conversation had reached its crescendo. Across Europe and the Americas, thousands of minds had been engaged in the great project of enlightenment, questioning authority, imagining alternatives, articulating principles that would reshape civilization. But ideas, no matter how powerful, exist in a realm of abstraction until they are tested against reality. In the next chapter, we will witness that testing, as Enlightenment philosophy descends from the heights of theory into the messy, violent, exhilarating world of political revolution. The power was about to pass from philosophers to the people. Chapter 4. The Power of the People. There comes a moment in history when ideas can no longer remain confined to books and letters, when philosophy demands to become action, when the conversations of intellectuals must either fade into irrelevance or transform into movements that shake the foundations of the world. The late 18th century was such a moment. For decades, Enlightenment thinkers had written about natural rights, about the consent of the governed, about the dignity of the individual and the corruption of hereditary privilege. They had imagined societies organized according to reason rather than tradition. They had questioned the divine right of kings and the authority of ancient institutions. And now, in the final quarter of the century, Those ideas were about to be tested in the crucible of revolution. What had been debated in salons would be decided in assemblies. What had been written on paper would be written in blood. The American colonies were the first testing ground, though few at the time realized they were witnessing anything more than a provincial rebellion on the edge of the known world. The dispute began prosaically enough, with arguments about taxation and representation, about whether Parliament had the right to impose duties on colonists who had no voice in that body. But beneath these practical grievances lay deeper philosophical questions, questions that the colonists had absorbed from their reading of Locke and Montesquieu, of Sidney and Harrington, of all the political theorists who had questioned absolute authority and imagined governments based on consent. The colonists were not initially revolutionaries. They were British subjects who believed their rights as Englishmen were being violated. They petitioned, they protested, they argued that they deserved the same liberties that Britons at home enjoyed. But each attempt at reconciliation failed. Each petition was ignored or rejected. And gradually, reluctantly, a more radical possibility began to take shape in colonial minds. If the British government would not respect their rights, if King and Parliament were determined to treat them as subjects to be ruled rather than citizens to be represented, then perhaps the connection itself should be severed. Perhaps the colonies should become not reformed provinces, but independent states. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, crystallized this shift. Paine was an unlikely revolutionary, an English corset maker turned journalist who had arrived in America only 2 years earlier. But he possessed a gift for clear, passionate prose that spoke to ordinary people rather than educated elites. He attacked not just specific British policies, but the entire principle of monarchy. Why should one person rule over millions simply because of the accident of birth? Why should Americans bow to a king 3,000 miles away who knew nothing of their lives and cared nothing for their welfare? Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God, Paine wrote, than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. This was not polite philosophical discourse. This was revolution speaking in a voice that everyone could understand. 6 months later, in July 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's prose elevated the American cause from a provincial tax dispute to a universal assertion of human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, the Declaration proclaimed, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here was Locke's philosophy, rendered in language so clear and compelling that it would echo across centuries. Government derived its authority from the consent of the governed. When government became destructive of the ends for which it was created, the people possessed the right to alter or abolish it. These were not new ideas, but never before had they been asserted so boldly, so publicly, as the foundation for an actual government. The war that followed was long and brutal, lasting 8 years and claiming tens of thousands of lives. The colonists were outmatched in almost every way: fewer soldiers, less money, no navy to speak of. Yet they possessed advantages that military might could not overcome. They were fighting on their own soil for their own homes, sustained by a belief that their cause was just. The British, meanwhile, were fighting a war that grew increasingly unpopular at home, thousands of miles from London, at enormous expense. And crucially, the Americans found allies. France, eager to weaken its rival Britain, provided money, weapons, and eventually troops and naval support. Spain and the Netherlands also joined against Britain. What had begun as a colonial rebellion became an international conflict that Britain could not win. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, recognizing American independence, it marked more than the birth of a new nation. It represented the first successful implementation of Enlightenment political philosophy. The Americans had not merely overthrown one king to replace him with another. They had created a republic, a government without hereditary monarchy or aristocracy, based explicitly on the principle that legitimate authority flows from the people. This was unprecedented. Republics had existed before, of course, ancient Rome, medieval Venice, the Dutch Republic. But none had been founded on the conscious application of philosophical principles. None had articulated their basis in universal human rights so clearly. The creation of the American Constitution in 1787 pushed the experiment further. The founders grappled with questions that had preoccupied Enlightenment thinkers. How do you prevent power from becoming tyrannical? How do you balance liberty with order? How do you create a government strong enough to function but not so strong that it threatens freedom? Their solution, a federal system with separation of powers, checks and balances, enumerated rights, was an ingenious attempt to build Enlightenment principles into the structure of government itself. Montesquieu had argued that power must be divided to prevent tyranny. The Constitution divided power among legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and further divided it between federal and state governments. Madison argued in the Federalist Papers that competing factions would check one another, that ambition would counteract ambition, creating a dynamic equilibrium that preserved liberty. The American experiment was watched closely across the Atlantic, nowhere more intently than in France. French officers who had fought alongside the Americans returned home with stories of a nation where men addressed one another as equals, where birth did not determine destiny, where commoners could rise to positions of power based on merit. French intellectuals, already steeped in Enlightenment philosophy, saw in America a proof that their theories could work in practice. If the Americans could throw off monarchy and establish a republic, why not France? Why not Europe? Why should any people continue to endure the arbitrary rule of kings and the inherited privileges of aristocrats when an alternative had been demonstrated to be viable? France in the 1780s was a kingdom groaning under contradictions. It was the richest and most populous nation in Europe, yet its government was bankrupt, drained by expensive wars and a tax system that exempted the wealthy while burdening the poor. It was the intellectual capital of the Enlightenment, the home of Voltaire and Rousseau, yet it remained an absolute monarchy where the king ruled by divine right and letters de cachet could send anyone to prison without trial. It was a society where brilliant commoners might rise through talent and education, yet the highest positions were reserved for those born into nobility. The pressure was building, like steam in a sealed vessel, and everyone could feel it. Something had to give. The crisis came to a head over finances. Years of deficit spending, particularly the cost of supporting the American Revolution, had left the French treasury empty. King Louis XVI, a well-meaning but weak ruler, tried various reforms, but each was blocked by privileged groups unwilling to surrender their tax exemptions. Finally, in desperation, Louis summoned the Estates General, an assembly representing the three estates of French society, clergy, nobility, and commoners, that had not met since 1614. It was meant to be a formality, a way to legitimize new taxes. Instead, it became the spark that ignited revolution. The Third Estate, representing the common people, arrived at Versailles in the spring of 1789 with demands that went far beyond taxation. They wanted a constitution. They wanted representation proportional to their numbers. They wanted an end to feudal privileges. When the nobility and clergy refused, when the king tried to shut down their assembly, the representatives of the Third Estate took an oath, the tennis court oath vowing not to disband until France had a constitution. It was an act of defiance that transformed subjects into citizens, that asserted the sovereignty of the people over the will of the king. Paris erupted. In July 1789, fearing that the king was preparing to suppress the assembly with military force, crowds seized weapons from armories and stormed the Bastille, a fortress and prison that symbolized royal tyranny. The fall of the Bastille on July 14th was not a major military victory. The fortress held only 7 prisoners, but it was a symbolic earthquake. The people had acted, had seized power from the state, and the king had been powerless to stop them. Across France, peasants rose up against their lords, burning manor houses and destroying the documents that recorded their feudal obligations. The old order was collapsing, not through careful reform, but through spontaneous, chaotic, exhilarating upheaval. The National Assembly, as the former Third Estate now called itself, worked frantically to channel this revolutionary energy into constructive form. In August, they abolished feudalism in a dramatic all-night session, with nobles and clergy renouncing their privileges in what seemed like a collective fever of idealism. Later that month, they adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that distilled Enlightenment principles into 17 articles. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, it began. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Here was Locke, here was Rousseau, here was the entire Enlightenment project transformed into fundamental law. Yet the revolution, once begun, was difficult to control. The Declaration spoke of universal rights, but what did that mean in practice? Did it include women? Did it include slaves in France's Caribbean colonies? Did it mean that everyone should have a vote, or only property owners? As these questions were debated, factions formed. The moderates, later called Girondins, wanted a constitutional monarchy like Britain's, with the king retained, but his power limited by law. The radicals, who would come to be called Jacobin, wanted a republic, wanted to abolish nobility entirely, wanted more sweeping changes. And the king himself, Louis XVI, vacillated, sometimes appearing to accept the new order, other times plotting with foreign monarchs to restore his absolute power. The revolution radicalized in stages, each crisis pushing it further leftward. When Louis attempted to flee France in 1791, trying to reach the border where foreign armies waited to restore him, he was caught and brought back to Paris. His attempt to escape destroyed whatever trust remained between crown and people. If the king was plotting with France's enemies, if he was willing to bring foreign invasion to restore his power, then how could he be trusted to uphold a constitutional settlement? The logic of events was pushing toward a conclusion that few had imagined just 2 years earlier: the abolition of monarchy itself. War accelerated everything. In 1792, as Austria and Prussia threatened to invade France to restore the old order, revolutionary fervor reached fever pitch. The assembly declared war, and volunteers flooded to join the revolutionary armies, singing the Marseillaise, that stirring anthem that called citizens to arms against tyranny. Let us march. Let impure blood water our fields. It was a call to total war, to the defense of revolution against the monarchies of Europe. And in this atmosphere of crisis, suspicion, and fear, moderation became impossible. Those who counseled caution were accused of being secret royalists. Those who defended the king were denounced as traitors. In September 1792, as Prussian armies advanced on Paris and panic gripped the city, crowds stormed the prisons and massacred more than 1,000 prisoners suspected of royalist sympathies. It was a horror that shocked even supporters of the revolution, a glimpse of the violence that lay beneath the surface of enlightened ideals. But there was no turning back now. The following day, the newly elected National Convention met for the first time and unanimously voted to abolish the monarchy. France was declared a republic. Year one of the new revolutionary calendar had begun. History itself was being reborn. The fate of Louis XVI became the question that divided the convention. Some argued that he should be exiled, that killing a king would make compromise with other European monarchies impossible. Others insisted that revolution required the complete break with the past, that there could be no republic while the king still lived. In January 1793, after a trial in which Louis was found guilty of conspiring against the nation, the convention voted on his sentence. By a margin of a single vote, they chose death. On January 21st, Louis XVI was guillotined in what is now the Place de la Concorde, his execution watched by thousands. The revolutionaries had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They had killed a king, not in the heat of battle or popular uprising, but through a deliberate legal process. The divine right of kings, that ancient principle that had governed Europe for centuries, had been repudiated in blood. The execution of Louis sent shockwaves across Europe. Every monarchy saw the French Revolution as an existential threat. Britain, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands all joined Austria and Prussia in a coalition against France. The Revolutionary Republic found itself at war with nearly all of Europe, fighting for its very survival. And internal enemies seemed equally threatening. In the Vendée region of western France, Catholic peasants rose in revolt against the revolutionary government's attacks on the church. Federalist revolts broke out in Lyon, Marseille, and other cities, rejecting the authority of Paris. Counter-revolutionary conspiracies were discovered or imagined everywhere. In this atmosphere of paranoia and genuine danger, the revolution entered its darkest phase. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, assumed dictatorial powers in the name of saving the revolution. Robespierre was a curious figure to find at the center of such violence. He was a lawyer from provincial Arras, known before the revolution for his opposition to the death penalty, a devoted follower of Rousseau who believed passionately in virtue and the general will. He was called the Incorruptible for his personal austerity and his refusal to be bought. Yet this mild-mannered idealist presided over what became known as the Terror, a period when the guillotine worked constantly, when denunciation could send anyone to the scaffold, when thousands died for the crime of being insufficiently revolutionary. The logic of the Terror was that the revolution had enemies within and without, and that only through ruthless elimination of those enemies could the Republic survive. Anyone who had been a noble, anyone who had questioned revolutionary policies, anyone denounced by neighbors or rivals, found themselves arrested and tried before revolutionary tribunals that rarely acquitted. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, went to the guillotine in October 1793. Leading Girondins were executed. Madame Roland, whose salon had been a center of moderate revolutionary thought, was guillotined, reportedly saying before she died, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" Even revolutionary heroes were not safe. Georges Danton, whose oratory had inspired the early revolution, was executed when he argued that the terror had gone too far. The revolution, it seemed, was devouring its own children. The terror claimed perhaps 40,000 lives over the course of a year, and countless more died in the civil wars that tore France apart. This was not what the philosophes had imagined when they wrote about reason and enlightenment. This was not the gentle progress toward human perfectibility that they had envisioned. And yet the revolutionaries justified their actions in the language of the Enlightenment, speaking of virtue and the general will, of the need to force people to be free, to eliminate obstacles to the regeneration of humanity. Rousseau had written that society corrupted natural goodness. The terror attempted to purify society by eliminating the corrupt. It was Enlightenment philosophy twisted into justification for mass murder, reason deployed in the service of fanaticism. Yet even in the midst of this horror, the revolution achieved things that would outlast the terror. It abolished slavery in French colonies in 1794, making France the first European nation to do so. It established the metric system, rationalizing weights and measures according to scientific principles. It created public education, opening schools to children regardless of birth or wealth. It proclaimed religious tolerance, separating church and state. It declared that careers should be open to talent, not restricted by birth. These reforms, born from Enlightenment principles, would survive the terror and shape the modern world. The terror ended in July 1794 when Robespierre himself was arrested and executed, the victim of a coalition of those who feared they would be his next targets. The revolution did not end, but it moderated. The Directory, a more conservative government, took power and tried to stabilize France, to find some middle ground between revolutionary ideals and practical governance. But France remained at war, and war created opportunities for ambitious men. Napoleon Bonaparte, a young artillery officer from Corsica, had distinguished himself in revolutionary campaigns. He was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly without scruple about using the revolution for his own ends. In 1799, Napoleon staged a coup, overthrowing the Directory and establishing himself as first consul, effectively dictator of France. He would later crown himself emperor, a final irony in a revolution that had begun by executing a king. Yet Napoleon saw himself as the heir of the revolution, not its betrayer. He consolidated its reforms, codifying them in the Napoleonic Code that would influence legal systems around the world. He spread revolutionary principles across Europe through conquest, abolishing feudalism in the territories he occupied, introducing meritocracy and rational administration. But he also established a new form of tyranny, one based not on divine right, but on military genius and personal ambition. Napoleon's armies marched across Europe, carrying the tricolor flag and the principles of the revolution, though often at the point of a bayonet. The old order fought back desperately, but it was fighting not just against French soldiers, but against ideas that had already taken root. When Napoleon occupied territories, he brought with him the Civil Code, which established legal equality, protected property rights, and abolished feudal privileges. He dissolved monasteries, confiscated church lands, and opened careers to talent regardless of birth. To the common people of Italy, Germany, and Spain, French occupation was paradoxical. It was foreign domination. Yet it also brought liberation from ancient oppressions that their own rulers had maintained. The impact of the French Revolution and Napoleon's conquests rippled outward in waves that would continue long after his defeat. In Haiti, enslaved people, inspired by the revolution's promise of liberty, rose up in 1791, eventually establishing the first black republic in the world after a brutal 13-year struggle. Toussaint Louverture, a former slave who became a brilliant military leader, had read the philosophers, understood the principles of the Enlightenment, and demanded that they be applied universally. When France betrayed the Haitian Revolution and attempted to reimpose slavery, the Haitians fought on alone, defeating professional armies sent to subjugate them. Their victory in 1804 was a powerful demonstration that the principles of equality and self-determination truly were universal, not reserved for Europeans alone. Across Latin America, colonists who had watched the American and French revolutions began to question Spanish and Portuguese rule. Simon Bolivar, educated in Europe and influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, led revolutions that liberated much of South America. He envisioned a continent of republics, united by shared principles of liberty and representative government. Though his dream of continental unity failed, by the 1820s, most of Latin America had achieved independence, establishing republics based on constitutions that echoed both the American and French revolutionary documents. In Europe itself, the genie could not be put back in the bottle. After Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the victorious monarchies attempted to restore the old order at the Congress of Vienna. Borders were redrawn, kings were returned to their thrones, and a system of international cooperation was established to prevent future revolutions. Yet the world had changed irrevocably. People had tasted liberty, had seen that kings could be overthrown, that commoners could govern themselves, that social hierarchies were not ordained by God, but were human creations that could be altered. These lessons could not be unlearned. The decades following 1815 saw wave after wave of revolutionary movements across Europe. In 1820, revolutions erupted in Spain, Portugal, and parts of Italy. In 1830, another revolution in France overthrew the restored Bourbon monarchy, and revolutions spread to Belgium, Poland, and several German and Italian states. The greatest wave came in 1848, when revolutions broke out simultaneously across Europe in France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, and beyond. These were bourgeois revolutions for the most part, led by middle-class liberals demanding constitutions, representative government, and national self-determination. Most were ultimately suppressed by conservative forces, yet they demonstrated that the revolutionary impulse had become part of European political culture, a standing challenge to autocratic rule. The ideas that had sparked revolution continued to evolve and multiply. The French Revolution had proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity. But what did equality truly mean? Political equality, equal rights before the law, equal access to political participation was only one dimension. What about economic equality? The Industrial Revolution, which was transforming Europe in the early 19th century, was creating new forms of inequality, new classes of factory workers who labored in terrible conditions for subsistence wages. Socialist thinkers began to argue that political revolution was insufficient, that true liberation required economic transformation as well. Charles Fourier imagined utopian communities where work would be organized cooperatively and wealth shared equally. Robert Owen, a British factory owner, attempted to create model communities based on socialist principles. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon declared that property is theft, arguing that the concentration of wealth in private hands was inherently unjust. And Karl Marx, drawing on German philosophy, British economics, and French revolutionary politics, developed a comprehensive theory that claimed to explain all of history as a struggle between classes, predicting that capitalism would inevitably be overthrown by a workers' revolution, just as feudalism had been overthrown by bourgeois revolution. These socialist and communist movements saw themselves as the true heirs of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, completing the work that had been left unfinished. The revolution had established political equality, but had left economic inequality intact. The next stage, they argued, would be social revolution, the abolition of private property and class distinctions, the creation of a society where everyone contributed according to their ability and received according to their need. These ideas would inspire revolutionary movements throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, leading eventually to the Russian Revolution and the establishment of communist states that claimed to embody the final realization of Enlightenment ideals. Yet there was another strand of thought emerging from the revolutionary era, one more skeptical about grand schemes for remaking society. Edmund Burke, the British politician and philosopher, had watched the French Revolution with growing horror. His reflections on the revolution in France, published in 1790, became the founding text of modern conservatism. Burke did not defend absolute monarchy or blind obedience to tradition, but he argued that society was a complex organism that had evolved over centuries, embodying accumulated wisdom that could not be captured in abstract principles. Revolutionary attempts to reconstruct society from scratch, guided only by reason, ignored this wisdom and would inevitably lead to chaos and tyranny, as indeed they had in France. Burke's critique raised questions that the Enlightenment had perhaps not adequately addressed. Was human reason really sufficient to solve all problems? Were traditions merely prejudices to be overcome, or did they contain insights that rational analysis alone could not achieve? Was gradual reform preferable to revolutionary transformation? Could order and liberty be reconciled, or did the pursuit of liberty inevitably threaten order? These questions would echo through the 19th and 20th centuries, as societies struggled to balance the competing demands of freedom and stability, individual rights and collective welfare, progress and preservation. The revolutionary era also revealed uncomfortable truths about the Enlightenment's limitations. The Declaration of the Rights of Man had proclaimed universal equality, yet women remained excluded from political life. Olympe de Gouges, a French playwright and activist, published her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791, demanding that women be granted the same rights as men. "Woman is born free and lives equal to man in her rights," she wrote, echoing and challenging the language of the original declaration. The revolutionary government responded by executing her in 1793. Mary Wollstonecraft's call for women's rights went similarly unheeded. The revolution that proclaimed universal human rights was apparently only interested in the rights of half of humanity. The treatment of colonial subjects exposed another profound contradiction. Even as France abolished slavery in 1794, Napoleon would reinstate it in 1802, unable to imagine that black people in the colonies deserved the same liberty that the revolution had fought for in France. When Haiti achieved independence through revolution, European nations and the United States refused to recognize it, fearing that successful slave rebellion would inspire similar uprisings elsewhere. The Enlightenment's universal principles, it seemed, were not quite as universal as their proponents claimed. Race, gender, and class remained barriers that reason alone could not overcome, prejudices so deeply embedded in society that even the most radical revolutionaries struggled to transcend them. Yet, for all its failures and contradictions, the revolutionary era had fundamentally transformed political consciousness. The idea that kings ruled by divine right had been shattered. The principle that governments existed to serve the people, not the reverse, had been established, if not yet fully implemented. The notion that individuals possessed rights that no government could legitimately violate had entered political discourse permanently. These ideas could be suppressed, ignored, violated, but they could no longer be unthought. Every subsequent political movement, whether liberal or socialist, nationalist or democratic, would draw on the vocabulary and principles established during the Age of Revolution. The revolutions had also demonstrated both the power and the danger of popular mobilization. When ordinary people acted collectively, when they claimed political agency and refused to accept their assigned place in the social hierarchy, they could topple governments and reshape societies. This was exhilarating to those who believed in human potential and terrifying to those who valued order and stability. The specter of mob violence, of the terror's arbitrary executions, would haunt political thought for generations, creating anxiety about democracy and popular sovereignty even among those who claimed to support it. The balance between order and liberty, between the rights of individuals and the needs of the community, between gradual reform and revolutionary transformation. These remained unresolved tensions as the 19th century progressed. Different nations found different settlements. Britain avoided revolution through gradual expansion of political rights, slowly extending the franchise and reforming corrupt institutions. The United States struggled with the contradiction between its founding principles and the reality of slavery, a struggle that would eventually erupt in civil war. France oscillated between republic, empire, and monarchy for decades before finally establishing a stable democratic system. Germany and Italy achieved national unification through combinations of popular movements and power politics. Russia remained autocratic, building pressure that would eventually explode in 1917. What united all these different paths was the legacy of Enlightenment thought as tested and transformed by revolution. The belief that societies could be rationally organized, that progress was possible, that human beings were not doomed to repeat the patterns of the past. These convictions shaped the modern world. So too did the recognition that reason alone was insufficient, that changing institutions was easier than changing human nature, that noble principles could be betrayed even by those who proclaimed them most fervently. The revolutionary era had been violent, chaotic, often cruel. The dreams of the philosophe, when translated into political action, had produced not enlightened harmony, but terror, dictatorship, and decades of war. Yet something had been gained, something that could not be taken back. The people had claimed power, if only briefly, and that claim echoed forward through time. Monarchs would continue to rule, aristocrats would cling to privilege, but they would do so knowing that their authority was contested, that alternatives existed, that what had been overthrown once could be overthrown again. As the smoke cleared from battlefields and barricades, as the guillotine fell silent and Napoleon was sent into final exile, Europe surveyed the wreckage and tried to understand what had happened. An age had ended. The old certainties of throne and altar, of inherited privilege and unquestioned authority had been shaken to their foundations. The Enlightenment's faith in reason and progress had been tested by fire and found both validated and wanting. The people had exercised power and demonstrated both its creative and destructive potential. The modern world was being born in these convulsions, a world where change was constant rather than exceptional, where political participation would gradually expand, where merit would increasingly matter more than birth, where education and opportunity would spread slowly and unevenly to larger portions of the population. It would not be the perfect world the philosopher had imagined. Injustice would persist, new forms of oppression would emerge alongside old ones, and progress would be neither inevitable nor linear. But the direction had been set, the possibilities had been demonstrated, and the conversation, that great Enlightenment conversation about human potential and political organization, would continue. The power had passed to the people, even if only in principle, even if only incompletely. And that principle, once established, would prove impossible to eradicate. Every subsequent struggle for justice, every movement for rights and recognition, every challenge to arbitrary authority would draw on the language and legacy of this revolutionary moment when ideas leaped from books into streets, when philosophy became politics, when the Enlightenment's bright promises were tested against the harsh realities of power. The age of revolution had been terrible and magnificent, enlightening and destructive, inspiring and horrifying. It had revealed both the heights to which human beings could aspire and the depths to which they could sink. It had shown that change was possible, but also that it carried costs that the philosophers in their studies had never fully reckoned. And as the 19th century unfolded, as the dust settled and new institutions took shape, humanity would grapple with the complex contradictory inheritance of this era when everything seemed possible, when the world was remade, and when the Enlightenment's children discovered that the light they carried could illuminate and burn in equal measure. End of chapter 4. The revolutions had come and gone, leaving behind transformed landscapes, political, social, intellectual. The old order had been challenged, though not everywhere defeated. The people had claimed power, though that claim remained contested. The Enlightenment's ideas had been tested in the crucible of action and found both powerful and problematic. In our final chapter, we will reflect on the legacy we have inherited, on how the Enlightenment shaped the world we inhabit today, and on the questions it left for us to answer. Chapter 5. The Legacy We Inherit. Close your eyes and imagine waking tomorrow in the world that existed before the Enlightenment. You open your eyes in a room lit only by candles or the first gray light of dawn. There is no electricity humming through wires, no devices connecting you to vast networks of information. If you are ill, there are no antibiotics, no understanding of germs, no scientific medicine to ease your pain. If you are curious about the world beyond your village, there are few books you can read, and those are written in languages you may not understand. Your position in society was determined at birth, and you will likely die in the same station. If you are a woman, your legal identity is absorbed into that of your father or husband. If you question the teachings of the church or the authority of the king, you risk punishment not just in this world, but eternal damnation in the next. The universe above you is a mystery that you are not meant to solve. The future stretches ahead unchanging, as it has been for your parents and their parents before them, as it will be for your children and theirs. Now open your eyes to the world we actually inhabit. The distance between these two worlds is the measure of the Enlightenment's impact. Everything that distinguishes modern life from that earlier age, our science and technology, our political systems and values, our assumptions about human dignity and rights, our belief that progress is possible and knowledge accessible, all of this flows from the key, intellectual revolution that began in the 17th century and reached its culmination in the 18th. We are the Enlightenment's children, whether we recognize it or not, living in a world shaped by its triumphs and haunted by its failures. The most obvious legacy is scientific. The method that Bacon and Descartes articulated, that Newton demonstrated so brilliantly, has transformed our understanding of everything. We have split the atom and mapped the genome, sent probes to the edge of the solar system, and peered back to the beginning of time. We have eliminated diseases that once killed millions, extended human lifespans by decades, and created technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. The Enlightenment's conviction that nature operates according to discoverable laws, that observation and experimentation can unlock its secrets, proved spectacularly correct. Science has given us power over the natural world that previous generations could not have imagined. Yet that power has come with responsibilities and dangers that the early Enlightenment thinkers did not foresee. Nuclear weapons demonstrate that scientific knowledge can threaten our very survival. Climate change reveals that our power over nature can disrupt systems we depend on. The technological transformation of society has brought unprecedented prosperity to some while leaving others behind, creating new forms of inequality alongside old ones. The Enlightenment promised that reason and science would improve the human condition, and in many ways they have. But we have learned that scientific knowledge alone does not determine how that knowledge will be used. That technical progress does not automatically translate into moral progress. That knowing how to do something does not settle whether we should do it. The political legacy is equally complex. Democracy, human rights, constitutional government, the rule of law, these are all products of Enlightenment thought, tested and refined through revolution and reform. The idea that governments exist to serve their citizens, that power must be limited and divided, that individuals possess fundamental rights that no majority can legitimately violate. These principles structure political life across much of the world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, reads like a distillation of Enlightenment philosophy, proclaiming the inherent dignity and equal rights of all members of the human family. Yet democracy remains fragile, contested, imperfectly realized. The exclusions that marred the Enlightenment, the denial of rights to women, to people of color, to the poor, persisted long after the Age of Revolution. Women in most democracies did not gain the vote until the 20th century. Legal segregation and discrimination continued in many nations well into our own era. And even now, even in societies that proclaim commitment to equality and human rights, vast disparities of power and wealth persist. The promise of government by consent of the governed coexists uneasily with the reality that some voices carry far more weight than others, that some lives are valued more highly than others, that formal equality before the law does not prevent systematic inequality in practice. Economic life has been transformed as profoundly as political and scientific domains. Adam Smith's insight that markets could coordinate complex economic activity without central planning helped unleash an era of growth and innovation unprecedented in human history. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain shortly after Smith published The Wealth of Nations, spread across the globe, transforming societies from agricultural to industrial, from rural to urban, from material scarcity to abundance, at least for some. Global trade has connected economies, making possible specialization and efficiencies that have raised living standards dramatically. Technologies born from scientific research have multiplied human productive capacity. Yet capitalism, That system built on Enlightenment principles of individual liberty and rational self-interest has generated its own problems and paradoxes. The wealth it creates is distributed profoundly unequally, both within and between nations. The creative destruction it unleashes disrupts lives and communities, leaving behind those unable to adapt. The pursuit of profit does not automatically serve the common good, and markets left entirely to themselves can produce outcomes: environmental devastation, dangerous products, exploitative labor conditions that most people find morally unacceptable. The tension between liberty and equality, between individual rights and collective welfare, that the Enlightenment grappled with remains unresolved, perhaps unresolvable, requiring constant negotiation and adjustment. The Enlightenment's legacy extends into the very structure of our thinking, the assumptions we carry about what it means to be human and how we should live. The idea that individuals possess intrinsic worth, that each person has the right to shape their own life, rather than simply fulfilling a role assigned by birth or tradition. This is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that we can hardly imagine thinking otherwise. Yet it is a relatively recent development, a product of Enlightenment philosophy that challenged centuries of different assumptions. The freedom to choose one's career, to marry for love rather than family arrangement, to question inherited beliefs, to pursue happiness as one defines it, these are Enlightenment gifts that we too easily take for granted. Education, too, reflects Enlightenment ideals, even as it struggles to fulfill them. The philosophe believed that ignorance was the enemy of progress, that education could liberate minds and transform societies. They imagined schools accessible to all, teaching not rote memorization of ancient texts, but critical thinking and practical knowledge. Today, public education is nearly universal in developed nations and spreading elsewhere. Literacy rates have soared from single digits in the 18th century to over 80% globally. Universities have expanded from elite institutions training clergy and aristocrats to mass institutions educating millions. Knowledge is more accessible than ever, available not just in libraries but instantly, through technologies that would seem miraculous to the philosophe. Yet education has not fulfilled all the hopes invested in it. Schools often reinforce existing inequalities rather than overcoming them. Access to quality education remains profoundly unequal, shaped by wealth and geography. And even universal literacy does not guarantee enlightenment in the sense the philosophe imagined. The same technologies that make knowledge accessible also spread misinformation, conspiracy theories, and propaganda. The ability to read does not automatically produce the critical thinking and rational judgment that Enlightenment thinkers assumed would naturally follow. We are learning painfully that information is not the same as wisdom, that access to knowledge is not the same as the ability to use it well. The Enlightenment's approach to religion has also left a complex legacy. The philosophe challenged religious authority, insisted on tolerance, and argued that faith should be a matter of individual conscience rather than state enforcement. The separation of church and state, religious freedom, the end of religious persecution, these achievements reflect Enlightenment principles. In much of the world, people can now worship as they choose or not worship at all without fear of legal punishment. This is a profound change from an era when religious uniformity was enforced through violence and when heresy was a capital crime. Yet the Enlightenment's relationship with religion was always complicated. Some philosophes were atheists, others deists who believed in a distant creator but rejected revealed religion. Still others maintained orthodox faith while arguing for tolerance. They united less in what they believed than in their insistence that belief should not be compelled. That reason should be applied even to religious questions, that no church should wield political power. This created a secular space for public life, a realm where policy could be debated on the basis of evidence and argument rather than scriptural authority. But secularism has proven more contested than the Enlightenment anticipated. Religious faith has not withered under the scrutiny of reason as some predicted it would. Instead, it has adapted, evolved, sometimes grown stronger in response to modernity's challenges. And the question of religion's place in public life remains contentious. How should societies that value both religious freedom and secular governance handle situations where religious convictions conflict with secular laws? How should we balance respect for diverse beliefs with commitment to universal human rights? These are questions the Enlightenment raised but did not resolve, questions each generation must answer anew. The Enlightenment also bequeathed us a particular way of thinking about progress. The philosophe believed that history was not cyclical, not a story of decline from a golden age, but a progressive movement toward greater knowledge, freedom, and happiness. This optimism shaped the modern world's self-understanding. We assume that we are more advanced than our ancestors, that our grandchildren will live better than we do, that problems have solutions waiting to be discovered. This belief in progress has been enormously productive, driving innovation and reform, creating a forward-looking culture focused on improvement rather than preservation. Yet the 20th century tested this optimism severely. 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes claiming to embody Enlightenment ideals, genocide carried out with industrial efficiency, nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization, these horrors called into question the unquestioned assumption that reason and science necessarily lead to human betterment. The philosophe had imagined that as knowledge increased, as reason spread, as ignorance and superstition were overcome, humanity would become more peaceful, more just, more humane. But the most technologically advanced societies proved capable of unprecedented barbarism. Reason could be deployed in service of terrible ends. Science could create instruments of mass destruction. Enlightenment principles could be twisted to justify oppression. The Holocaust, in particular, shook confidence in Enlightenment ideals. How could the nation of Kant and Goethe, one of Europe's most educated and culturally sophisticated societies, descend into such evil? How could rational bureaucracies organize systematic murder on an industrial scale? The Frankfurt School philosophers, reflecting on these questions in the aftermath of World War II, argued that the Enlightenment contained seeds of its own undoing, that instrumental reason divorced from ethical constraints could become an engine of domination. They did not reject the Enlightenment entirely, but they insisted on recognizing its dark side, its capacity to be perverted. In the decades following World War II, critiques of the Enlightenment multiplied and deepened. Post-colonial thinkers pointed out that European Enlightenment had coexisted comfortably with colonial domination, that the same nations proclaiming liberty and equality at home brutally exploited peoples abroad. The universal human rights proclaimed so eloquently were apparently not meant to apply to those colonized and enslaved. Edward Said argued that Enlightenment thought had constructed the Orient as backward and irrational, justifying Western domination as a civilizing mission. The light of reason, it seemed, had cast shadows of racism and imperialism that the philosophe either failed to see or chose to ignore. Feminist scholars similarly challenged the Enlightenment's universalist claims. The rights of man, proclaimed so boldly, excluded women systematically. The rational autonomous individual imagined by Enlightenment philosophy was implicitly male, his independence made possible by the unpaid labor of women in the domestic sphere. The public realm of politics and commerce, where Enlightenment ideals operated, was defined against a private realm of family and reproduction where different rules applied. To truly universalize Enlightenment principles required rethinking them fundamentally, recognizing forms of oppression and exclusion built into their original formulation. Environmental concerns raised yet another set of challenges. The Enlightenment project of mastering nature, of using reason and science to bend the natural world to human purposes, had succeeded spectacularly. But that success now threatened the ecological systems on which human life depends. Climate change, species extinction, pollution, resource depletion, these are consequences of the very power over nature that the Enlightenment sought. Francis Bacon's vision of science as a means to command nature in action had been realized, but nature was proving less infinitely exploitable than assumed. The Enlightenment's human-centered worldview, its treatment of nature as mere resource rather than as possessing its own value, now seemed dangerously short-sighted. Yet for all these valid critiques, wholesale rejection of the Enlightenment seems neither possible nor desirable. The tools we use to criticize Enlightenment ideals' rational argument, empirical evidence, appeals to universal human dignity, are themselves products of Enlightenment thought. The values we invoke when we condemn colonialism, sexism, or environmental destruction, equality, freedom, justice, derive from Enlightenment philosophy, even if that philosophy failed to apply them consistently. We cannot step outside the Enlightenment's legacy to critique it from some neutral position. We can only work within it, extending its principles more fully, addressing its blind spots, correcting its errors. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Enlightenment, that our understanding is always incomplete, always subject to revision, that progress comes not from possessing final truth, but from continually questioning, testing, and refining our beliefs. The philosophes challenged the authorities of their time, but they did not claim infallibility for themselves. The scientific method they championed assumes that theories will be superseded, that today's knowledge is tomorrow's approximation. This spirit of humble inquiry, of willingness to change one's mind in light of evidence, is an Enlightenment inheritance we desperately need to preserve. In our contemporary world, we face challenges that would both fascinate and terrify the philosophe. Artificial intelligence raises questions about consciousness, agency, and what it means to be human. Genetic engineering offers the possibility of reshaping human nature itself, forcing us to confront whether we should exercise powers we are developing. Global interconnection brings unprecedented opportunities for cooperation and catastrophic risks of pandemic or conflict. Climate change demands collective action on a scale never before attempted. These challenges require precisely the kind of rational, evidence-based, cooperative problem-solving that the Enlightenment championed. Yet we are also learning the limits of Enlightenment rationality. Human beings are not purely rational calculators of self-interest, as some Enlightenment thinkers assumed. We are emotional, social creatures shaped by culture and history, by unconscious biases and tribal loyalties. Presenting people with facts does not automatically change their minds. Rational arguments do not always prevail over appeals to identity and emotion. The marketplace of ideas does not automatically produce truth when falsehoods spread faster than corrections, when algorithms amplify outrage over nuance, when people retreat into echo chambers that reinforce rather than challenge their existing beliefs. Democracy, that Enlightenment ideal, faces challenges its architects did not foresee. How does representative government function in societies of hundreds of millions rather than thousands? How can citizens make informed decisions about complex technical issues? How do we maintain democratic discourse when traditional gatekeepers of information have lost authority and social media algorithms optimize for engagement rather than truth? How do we balance majority rule with minority rights when societies are deeply polarized? These are questions the philosophe grappled with, but the scale and complexity of modern societies create problems they could not have anticipated. The tension between individual liberty and collective welfare, central to Enlightenment political thought, remains unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. The COVID-19 pandemic crystallized this tension in vivid form. Public health measures required collective action and individual sacrifice for the common good. Yet they also restricted personal freedom in ways that sparked fierce resistance. Different societies found different balances, reflecting different weightings of Enlightenment values. Neither pure individualism nor pure collectivism provides adequate answers. We must continually negotiate between competing goods, accepting that perfect solutions may not exist. The Enlightenment's legacy is perhaps most powerfully felt in the realm of human rights, that grand project of establishing universal principles that protect human dignity. The declarations of rights from the revolutionary era have been expanded, elaborated, and internationalized. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was followed by covenants on civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Special conventions protect the rights of women, children, refugees, persons with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. International courts and tribunals provide forums for enforcing these rights. The idea that there are standards of treatment that all governments must respect, that sovereignty does not grant unlimited power over citizens, represents a profound shift from the absolute authority that rulers claimed before the Enlightenment. Yet the universality of human rights remains contested. Some argue that rights are Western concepts being imposed on non-Western societies, that different cultures have different values that should be respected. Others point out that appeals to cultural relativism are often made by authoritarian rulers seeking to justify oppression, that victims of abuse rarely invoke cultural difference to defend their mistreatment. The Enlightenment assumed that reason could discover universal moral truths, but we have learned that moral reasoning is shaped by culture and experience, that people of goodwill can disagree profoundly about fundamental questions. This does not mean all positions are equally valid, but it does mean that establishing universal principles requires ongoing dialogue, negotiation, and humility rather than simple assertion. The spread of Enlightenment ideals has been uneven geographically and temporally. Democratic governance, respect for human rights, scientific progress, these are not universal realities but aspirations more fully realized in some places than others. The Enlightenment began in Europe and North America, and these regions have generally been more shaped by its legacy. But Enlightenment ideas have also inspired movements worldwide, anti-colonial struggles, pro-democracy movements, campaigns for women's rights and LGBTQ+ equality, environmental activism. These movements adapt Enlightenment principles to local contexts, sometimes challenging the Western-centric assumptions embedded in their original formulations. The digital revolution presents both opportunities and challenges for Enlightenment values. The Internet has democratized access to information in ways the philosophe could only dream of. Knowledge that once required access to great libraries is now available to anyone with an Internet connection. Communication across vast distances is instantaneous and nearly free. Marginalized voices can find audiences without gatekeepers. Citizen journalism can expose abuses of power. These developments embody Enlightenment ideals of free inquiry and open communication. Yet the digital age has also created new problems. The sheer volume of information available overwhelms our capacity to process it. Algorithms shape what we see, often in ways we don't understand, creating filter bubbles that isolate us from perspectives different from our own. Disinformation spreads rapidly, exploiting cognitive biases and emotional triggers. Surveillance technologies give governments and corporations unprecedented power to monitor and manipulate populations. Artificial intelligence raises questions about autonomy, privacy, and control that we are only beginning to grapple with. The Enlightenment assumed that more information and communication would lead to greater understanding and wisdom, but we are learning that these outcomes are not automatic. The Enlightenment's faith in reason must be tempered by recognition of reason's limits. Neuroscience and behavioral economics have demonstrated that human decision-making is far less rational than Enlightenment thinkers assumed. We are subject to systematic biases, prone to motivated reasoning that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, influenced by framing effects and emotional states. Yet acknowledging these limitations does not mean abandoning reason. It means using reason to understand its own constraints, developing institutions and practices that help us overcome our biases rather than being ruled by them. This is Enlightenment about enlightenment, a self-aware application of critical thinking to the very tools of critical thinking. Education remains central to realizing Enlightenment ideals, but we must rethink what education means. Memorizing facts matters less when information is instantly accessible. What we need instead is the ability to evaluate information critically, to distinguish reliable sources from unreliable ones, to recognize logical fallacies and emotional manipulation, to engage constructively with people who disagree with us. We need not just technical skills, but wisdom, practical judgment about how to live well, how to balance competing values, how to navigate moral complexity. The philosopher understood that education was not merely vocational training, but preparation for citizenship and for life. We need to recover that broader vision. The Enlightenment's legacy includes not just specific ideas and institutions, but a spirit, an attitude toward the world. It is the conviction that we need not passively accept things as they are, that we can understand and improve our circumstances through inquiry and effort. It is the belief that all human beings possess dignity and potential regardless of birth or status. It is the commitment to evidence over authority, to argument over violence, to tolerance over persecution. It is the willingness to question, to doubt, to revise our understanding when confronted with new evidence. It is, above all, the refusal to surrender to fatalism, the insistence that we are not merely victims of forces beyond our control, but agents capable of shaping our own destiny. This spirit is perhaps the Enlightenment's most enduring gift, more important than any specific doctrine or institution. Doctrines can be mistaken, institutions can become corrupt, but the spirit of critical inquiry, of openness to revision, of commitment to human dignity, these can guide us through challenges the philosopher never imagined. When we confront new problems, we can ask what the Enlightenment spirit demands. Not what did 18th century thinkers believe, but how would they approach this question? With what combination of rigorous analysis, moral seriousness, and openness to evidence? As we stand here, deep into the 21st century, we find ourselves at a curious juncture. We have inherited more from the Enlightenment than its original architects could have imagined, technologies that seem like magic, scientific knowledge that has unlocked the fundamental structure of reality, political systems that, however imperfectly, recognize the dignity and agency of ordinary people. Yet we also face challenges that call into question some of the Enlightenment's core assumptions. We know now that reason alone cannot guarantee moral progress, that scientific knowledge can be used for destruction as well as creation, that increasing material prosperity does not automatically produce happiness or fulfillment. The climate crisis stands as perhaps the ultimate test of Enlightenment principles. It is a problem that science has clearly identified, that requires collective rational action to address, that threatens human welfare on a vast scale. Yet our response has been halting, inadequate, undermined by short-term thinking and narrow self-interest. The Enlightenment assumed that once people understood a problem rationally, they would act to solve it. But we have discovered that understanding is not enough, that action requires political will, moral courage, and the ability to sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term benefit. The philosopher understood individual psychology, but perhaps underestimated the difficulty of achieving collective rationality, of getting millions or billions of people to coordinate around shared goals. Yet we must not conclude from these difficulties that the Enlightenment project has failed. Rather, we must recognize that it is incomplete, that each generation must renew and extend it. The philosopher gave us tools, reason, evidence, critical inquiry, commitment to human dignity, but they could not solve all problems for all time. They opened doors, but could not walk through every one themselves. That work falls to us and to those who will come after us. The exclusions that marred the original Enlightenment have been progressively challenged and overcome, though much work remains. Women have claimed the rights that Wollstonecraft demanded, though gender equality remains incomplete. Colonial peoples have achieved independence and demanded recognition of their own intellectual traditions. Civil rights movements have challenged racial hierarchies, though racism persists in new forms. LGBTQ+ people have fought for and won recognition and rights that previous generations denied them. Each of these movements has extended Enlightenment principles more fully, applying them to people the original philosopher excluded or ignored. This is not betrayal of the Enlightenment, but its fulfillment, the realization of its own internal logic of universal human dignity. We are learning, slowly and painfully, that Enlightenment ideals must be balanced with other values: community, tradition, care, ecological sustainability. The Enlightenment emphasized individual autonomy, but we are deeply social beings who find meaning in relationships and belonging. It emphasized reason, but emotion and intuition also have legitimate roles in human life. It emphasized human dominion over nature, but we are part of nature, dependent on systems we can disrupt, but not control. Enlightenment principles need not be abandoned, but they must be integrated into a more complex understanding of what it means to live well, to flourish as individuals and communities on a finite planet. The greatest gift the Enlightenment gave us may be the gift of hope, not naive optimism that everything will automatically improve, but realistic hope that improvement is possible through human effort. The world we inhabit is dramatically better in many ways than the world of 1700. Fewer people live in absolute poverty. Fewer children die in infancy. More people can read, can participate in governance, can pursue their own vision of a good life. These gains are real, even if unevenly distributed, even if accompanied by new problems. They demonstrate that conscious effort to improve the human condition can succeed, that we are not helpless before fate or fortune. This hope is what we most need to preserve. The challenges ahead, climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, threats to democracy, inequality within and between nations are daunting. It would be easy to despair, to conclude that the problems are too large, too complex, too deeply rooted to solve. But the Enlightenment teaches us that problems once thought insoluble can yield to patient effort, that institutions once thought eternal can be reformed or replaced, that progress, though not inevitable, is possible. Our ancestors overthrew monarchies that had ruled for centuries, abolished slavery that had existed for millennia, extended rights and opportunities that had been restricted to narrow elites. If they could accomplish such transformations with the tools available to them, what might we achieve with all that we have inherited? The work of enlightenment is never finished. Each generation must fight its own battles against ignorance and injustice, must apply reason to new problems, must extend the circle of moral concern, must resist the forces of unreason and authoritarianism. The philosopher could not have anticipated artificial intelligence or genetic engineering, climate change or nuclear weapons, social media or global pandemics. These are our challenges to confront, using the tools they gave us, but adapting them to circumstances they never imagined. And when we face these challenges, we would do well to remember both the achievements and the failures of the Enlightenment. Remember its bold vision of human potential, its confidence that reason and evidence can illuminate even the darkest corners of existence. Remember its commitment to human dignity, its insistence that all people deserve respect and freedom regardless of birth or status. Remember its spirit of questioning, its refusal to accept authority without evidence, its openness to revising beliefs in light of new information. These are gifts we must cherish and pass on. But remember too its blind spots and prejudices, its unwarranted confidence in simple solutions, its failure to recognize forms of oppression and exploitation, even as it proclaimed universal principles. Remember that reason can be used to rationalize as well as to enlighten, that science can destroy as well as create, that progress in one domain does not guarantee progress in all domains. Remember that human beings are complex creatures, not purely rational calculators, and that wisdom requires balancing reason with other human capacities, emotion, intuition, moral imagination, care for others. The Enlightenment invited us into a conversation, a great ongoing dialogue about how we should live, how we should organize our societies, how we can use our capacities for thought and creativity to build a better world. That conversation continues. Every time we question authority and demand evidence, every time we stand up for human dignity and rights, every time we apply critical thinking to problems and refuse to accept injustice as inevitable, we participate in that conversation. We are the Enlightenment's heirs, but we are not bound by every position its original thinkers held. We honor them best not by treating their words as scripture, but by applying their methods to our own challenges, by carrying forward their spirit of inquiry and reform. As you drift toward sleep tonight, carried by this story of how humanity awakened to its own potential, let yourself feel gratitude for the inheritance we have received. We stand on the shoulders of those who dared to question, to imagine, to challenge the way things had always been. We benefit every day from their courage and their insight, from the institutions they built and the principles they articulated. But let yourself also feel the weight of responsibility that comes with this inheritance. The work is not finished. The light they kindled must be tended, must be carried forward, must be shared with those still in darkness. The Enlightenment was not an ending but a beginning. It opened possibilities that we are still exploring, asked questions we are still answering, started conversations we must continue. Its legacy is not a set of final truths, but a method, a spirit, a commitment to using our capacities for reason and compassion to create a world worthy of human dignity. That legacy lives in every library and laboratory, in every courtroom and classroom, in every act of critical thinking and moral courage. It lives in us if we choose to embrace it, if we commit ourselves to the ongoing work of enlightenment. And so, as the night deepens and this story comes to its close, rest in the knowledge that you are part of something larger than yourself, part of a centuries-long project to expand human knowledge and freedom, to overcome ignorance and oppression, to build societies where everyone can flourish. The philosophes did their part. The revolutionaries did theirs. Countless others across generations have contributed to the work. Now it falls to us and to those who will come after to carry the light forward. Sleep now with the quiet confidence that dawn will come again, as it always has, as it always will for those who refuse to surrender to darkness. The Enlightenment taught us that we need not accept the world as we find it, that we possess the power to understand and to change, to question and to improve. That knowledge, that hope, that possibility, this is the legacy we inherit. This is the gift we must preserve and pass on. This is the light that must never be allowed to go out. End of chapter 5. And so our journey through the Enlightenment comes to rest. From the shadowed world before reason's dawn, through the brilliant minds who dared to question everything, across the republic of letters where ideas flowed like rivers, into the streets where those ideas became revolutions, and finally to our own time where we grapple with the complex inheritance of that extraordinary age. The story of the Enlightenment is not merely history. It is the story of how we became who we are, of how humanity learned to think for itself, to claim its own power, to imagine and build better worlds. May this story accompany you into peaceful sleep, and may you wake with renewed appreciation for the light we carry and the responsibility we bear to keep it burning bright.